Hey guys, welcome back to The Sleep Historian, where we explore the fascinating details of daily life throughout history. Tonight's journey takes us to the windswept shores of Scandinavia, roughly between 800 and 1050 CE, where we'll discover what it was actually like to live inside a Viking longhouse. Not the dramatic raids, not the epic sagas, not the violent conquests, just the everyday reality of eating, sleeping, working, and surviving in a structure that was part home, part workshop, part barn, and entirely central to Norse life. From the smoke-filled rafters where fish hung drying to the carefully maintained Central Hearth that meant the difference between life and death during the long northern winters. Their story is one of remarkable adaptation, ingenious resourcefulness, and the level of communal living that would probably drive most of us absolutely insane within about 48 hours. Picture this. 30 to 50 people, several generations of the same family, possibly some thralls, that's slaves by the way, a few chickens, maybe a cow or two, all living under one roof that's about 60 to 90 feet long, and maybe 15 to 20 feet wide. No private bedrooms. No indoor plumbing, obviously. No escape from the smell of unwashed bodies, animal manure, fish oil lamps, and whatever someone's cooking over the fire. The walls are thick turf or timber, the floor is packed earth mixed with who knows what, and the only real source of heat and light is that central fire pit, which fills the entire space with a permanent haze of smoke that eventually finds its way out through the roof. Was it cozy? In its own medieval way, perhaps. Was it comfortable by modern standards? Absolutely not. But for the Vikings, this was home, and they'd perfected the art of making it work over generations of incremental improvements and hard-won wisdom about surviving in one of the most challenging climates humans have ever chosen to inhabit permanently. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself settled in, and let's journey back to the world of the Viking Longhouse, where life moved at the pace of the seasons, warmth was a precious commodity, and privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Chapter 1. The structure itself. More than just 4 walls and a roof. Let's start with the building itself, because before we can understand what life was like inside a Viking longhouse, we need to appreciate what an impressive feat of engineering these structures actually were, even if they don't look particularly impressive to modern eyes. A Viking longhouse wasn't just thrown together in a weekend with whatever materials happened to be lying around. It was a carefully planned structure designed to withstand some of the harshest weather conditions on the planet, last for generations if properly maintained, and serve multiple crucial functions simultaneously. The design varied somewhat depending on the region. Norwegian longhouses differed slightly from Swedish ones, which differed from Icelandic ones. But the basic principles remained remarkably consistent across the Viking world. The foundation, such as it was, typically consisted of large stones placed at strategic intervals to support the main structural posts. These weren't elaborate foundations in the modern sense, just heavy rocks that would keep the wooden posts from sinking into the ground or rotting too quickly from ground moisture. In boggy areas or regions with particularly wet soil, builders sometimes created raised platforms or used additional stone padding to improve drainage. The main structural supports were substantial wooden posts, usually made from oak if it was available, which it often wasn't in places like Iceland, where trees were already becoming scarce even before the Vikings arrived. These posts, called staffa in Old Norse, were the skeleton of the entire building, and they needed to be strong enough to support not just the walls, but also the considerable weight of the roof, which was substantially heavier than you might imagine. The walls themselves were constructed using one of several methods, depending on what materials were locally available and what the climate demanded. In forested areas of Norway and Sweden, walls were often built using a technique called stave construction, where vertical wooden planks were slotted into grooves in horizontal timber sills and headers. Think of it as a very large, very primitive version of tongue-and-groove flooring, but vertical. The gaps between planks were stuffed with moss, animal hair, or anything else that might keep out the wind, because Viking Scandinavia was not the place to have drafty walls. In other regions, particularly Iceland and Greenland, where timber was scarce and expensive, walls were often constructed primarily from turf. Yes, dirt and grass, stacked like enormous bricks against a wooden frame. These turf walls could be 2 or 3 feet thick, which sounds excessive until you remember that they needed to keep out winter storms that could last for weeks and drop temperatures to genuinely life-threatening levels. A well-constructed turf wall was actually remarkably effective insulation, far better than you'd expect from what is essentially a wall made of dirt. The combination of soil, roots, and living or dead grass created a dense barrier that retained heat surprisingly well and blocked wind effectively. The downside? Turf walls were heavy, required constant maintenance, needed to be rebuilt every generation or so, sometimes developed interesting drainage problems if not constructed properly, and had a tendency to host various small creatures who appreciated the shelter just as much as the humans did. Mice were a constant companion in turf-walled longhouses, along with various insects, and there wasn't much to be done about it except keep a cat or two, and accept that you were sharing your home with a local fauna. The roof was perhaps the most critical element of the entire structure, because a leaking roof in a Viking winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It could be genuinely dangerous. Roofs were typically constructed using a timber frame covered with birch bark for waterproofing, then topped with either turf or wooden shingles, depending again on available materials. The turf roof, when used, was just as thick as the turf walls, sometimes thicker, and was heavy enough that the structural posts needed to be substantial and strategically placed to avoid the whole thing collapsing inward during a heavy snow. Vikings were well aware of this problem, as evidenced by the careful attention paid to roof pitch. Steep enough to shed water and snow, but not so steep that the turf would slide off, and the use of intermediate support posts inside the structure to help carry the load. The roof peak typically included some form of smoke hole, though calling it a hole suggests something more precisely engineered than the reality. It was more like an intentionally unfinished section at the very top, where the 2 roof slopes met, covered with a removable wooden piece that could be adjusted to let out smoke while keeping out rain and snow as much as possible. This was a constant balancing act, and on stormy days, you basically had to choose between suffocating in smoke or getting rained on. The Vikings chose smoke. Always smoke. A little rain was manageable. No fire meant freezing to death. Let's talk dimensions for a moment, because scale matters when we're trying to imagine what it was like inside one of these structures. A typical longhouse for a farming family of moderate means might be somewhere around 60 feet long and 16 feet wide. Those sizes varied tremendously. A wealthy chieftain might have a longhouse stretching to 100 feet or more, while a poor farmer might make do with something barely 40 feet long. The walls were usually somewhere between 6 and 8 feet high at the eaves, rising to perhaps 12 or 15 feet at the center peak. This wasn't a lot of vertical space, especially once you factor in that smoke hung in the upper portions of the building almost constantly, so the actual usable space with breathable air was even less. The interior was typically divided into 3 main sections, though not with actual walls in most cases, just conceptual divisions in how the space was used. The center section, which might take up half or more of the total length, was the main living area. This is where the Central Hearth sat, where people gathered to eat and work, where the family spent most of their time when not sleeping or working outdoors. The 2 end sections served various purposes: storage, workshops, sleeping areas for thralls or less important family members, and sometimes even housing for valuable animals during the worst of winter. Some longhouses had small separate rooms partitioned off with wooden walls or curtains, but this was more common in later periods or in the homes of wealthier families. Most people simply lived in one big open space, which is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. The entrance was usually positioned on one of the long walls, often facing south or east to minimize the amount of cold north wind that blew in every time someone opened the door. And that door was itself a feat of carpentry. A heavy wooden affair that needed to seal reasonably well, but also be operable by anyone in the household, including children and elderly people. Door hinges were made from leather or wood, as iron was too precious to waste on such things in many households, and the door itself was probably kept closed as much as humanly possible during winter, with people clustering near the fire and minimizing trips outside to only the absolutely necessary. Some longhouses also featured a sort of entrance hallway or porch area, though calling it a porch gives it entirely too much credit. It was more like a small enclosed space just inside the door, where people could stomp off snow, leave their outdoor shoes or boots, and perhaps store tools or outdoor equipment that needed to be protected from the elements, but didn't need to be inside the main living space. This transitional zone helped keep the worst of the wind and weather from blowing directly into the living area every time someone came or went, which was a significant quality of life improvement when you remember that these buildings had no central heating beyond that single fire pit. Now, imagine you're standing inside this structure on a winter evening. The wind is howling outside, rattling the door and finding every tiny gap in the walls. The fire is burning in the central hearth, casting flickering light and shadows across the interior. Smoke hangs in the rafters, thick enough that you wouldn't want to stand up too straight. The smell is a complex mixture of wood smoke, cooking food, unwashed humans and animals, drying fish or meat hanging from the rafters, and earth from the floor and walls. It's warm near the fire, but noticeably cooler as you move toward the walls. People are scattered around the hearth, working on various tasks in the firelight. Children are probably playing something that's simultaneously adorable and incredibly annoying. Someone is telling a story, their voice competing with the wind outside. This is home. This is where life happens. This is the Viking Longhouse. Chapter 2. The Heart of the Home, the Central Hearth and Fire Management. If the Longhouse itself was the shell that protected Viking families from the elements, then the Central Hearth was the beating heart that kept everything alive. This wasn't just where people cooked food, though it certainly was that. It wasn't just a source of light, though that was crucial. It wasn't just the only reliable source of heat during winters that could kill you if you weren't careful, though that was perhaps its most vital function. The hearth was the social center of the household, the place where decisions were made, stories were told, work was accomplished, and the family existed as a cohesive unit. In a very real sense, the family was defined by the hearth they gathered around, and allowing someone to sit at your hearth was extending them a significant degree of hospitality and, by extension, protection. The hearth itself was deceptively simple in construction, but remarkably sophisticated in function. In its most basic form, it was a rectangular or oval fire pit dug into the packed earth floor, typically located in the center of the main living area. The pit might be anywhere from a foot to 3 feet deep, lined with stones or clay if available, and perhaps 8 to 12 feet long by 3 or 4 feet wide. The exact dimensions varied based on the size of the longhouse and the wealth of the family. But the principle remained the same. Create a contained area where fire could burn safely without spreading to the rest of the structure or sinking too far into the ground. Some hearths were edged with stones to better contain the fire and provide a place to set pots or pans, while others were simply depressions in the earth, with perhaps some clay hardened by repeated firing. The positioning of this hearth was not arbitrary or random. It needed to be far enough from the walls that flying sparks wouldn't set anything on fire, but central enough that its heat could radiate throughout the living space. It needed to be positioned so that smoke would naturally rise to the roof opening rather than settling in the living area, which meant understanding prevailing wind patterns and how they affected the interior airflow. Some longhouses had multiple hearths, though this was more common in larger structures or in buildings serving multiple family units, and managing multiple fires in one enclosed space was its own particular challenge in terms of smoke management and fuel consumption. The fuel for these fires was a constant concern and a significant part of household labor, particularly in regions where timber was scarce. In well-forested areas of Norway and Sweden, wood was the primary fuel, and families needed to lay in substantial stores before winter arrived. We're not talking about a few wheelbarrows of firewood here. We're talking about enough wood to keep a fire burning almost continuously for 6 to 8 months, which is an absolutely enormous quantity. A typical family might need several tons of wood to make it through winter, and all of that needed to be cut, split, hauled, and stored during the warmer months when such work was possible. In Iceland and Greenland, where trees were scarce or non-existent, fuel sources became more creative and considerably less pleasant. Peat was harvested from bogs, cut into rectangular blocks, and dried for months before it could be burned. Peat burns cooler and smokier than wood, produces a distinctive earthy smell, and creates a different quality of heat. But it was available in quantities that made it viable where wood wasn't an option. Animal dung, particularly from cattle and sheep, was also dried and used as fuel. Yes, burning dried manure in your living space. The smell was exactly what you'd imagine, though people acclimated to it over time. The same way you can eventually stop noticing any persistent smell if you're exposed to it long enough. Driftwood was collected from beaches whenever possible, though it was often treated as a valuable commodity rather than everyday fuel, because of its scarcity. Managing the fire itself was skilled work, not the sort of thing you could just leave to chance or to the youngest member of the household who didn't know what they were doing. Someone, usually an experienced adult, needed to maintain the fire at a level that provided adequate heat and light without consuming fuel so rapidly that supplies would run out before spring. This meant understanding how to bank fires overnight, so they'd smolder through the dark hours without going out completely. How to revive a fire from embers in the morning. How to adjust the fire based on weather conditions and cooking needs, and how to manage smoke so the interior remained livable. Let me be very clear about the smoke situation, because this is one of those historical realities that's difficult to fully appreciate from our modern, well-ventilated perspective. The longhouse was perpetually smoky. Not occasionally smoky when someone was cooking. Not a little hazy in one corner. Perpetually, thoroughly, inescapably smoky. The smoke from the central hearth rose toward the ceiling, where it accumulated in the upper portion of the structure, before eventually finding its way out through the roof opening. The lower portion of the longhouse, roughly from floor level to about head height if you were sitting down, had reasonably clear air most of the time. Above that, you were increasingly in the smoke zone. Stand up straight and you'd be coughing. Climb into the rafters for some reason and you'd be in thick, eye-watering smoke. This had several practical implications. First, people spent a lot of time sitting rather than standing, which the Vikings seem to have understood intuitively. Second, anything stored in the rafters, and many things were, including drying fish, meat and herbs, got thoroughly smoked in the process, which was actually intentional for food preservation purposes. Third, everyone who lived in a longhouse smelled perpetually of smoke, had smoke-irritated eyes, and probably had respiratory systems that weren't doing great by modern health standards. Viking skeletons show evidence of respiratory issues consistent with living in chronically smoky environments, which is about as surprising as finding out that medieval people had dental problems. The smoke did serve some useful purposes beyond the obvious one of food preservation. It kept the interior relatively dry by carrying moisture out through the roof, helped to preserve the wooden structural elements by coating them with creosote and other smoke residues that deterred insects and rot, and probably helped to control some pest populations that couldn't tolerate the constant irritation. But let's be honest, these were silver linings on a cloud of smoke that was fundamentally just one of the unpleasant realities of pre-modern life that people endured because there wasn't a better alternative. Fire safety was a constant concern in a structure where the walls might be partially made of wood. The roof definitely was. And everything inside, from bedding to clothing to stored food, was flammable. The hearth was designed to contain the fire, but sparks could and did escape. Longhouses burned down with some regularity, which is why archaeological sites sometimes show evidence of multiple longhouses built in succession on the same spot over the centuries. People were careful, but careful doesn't mean accidents never happened. A strong draft through the door at the wrong moment could blow sparks onto dry rushes spread on the floor. Someone could trip and scatter embers. The roof could catch if conditions were right and someone had been careless. When a longhouse burned, it was catastrophic. Everything the family owned might be destroyed in the matter of minutes. People could be killed, especially if the fire started at night when everyone was asleep. This wasn't a situation where you could call the fire department or replace your belongings with insurance money. A longhouse fire could reduce a prosperous family to poverty essentially overnight, which is why fire maintenance was taken so seriously and why someone reliable needed to be responsible for the hearth at all times. The fire was never allowed to go out if it could possibly be avoided, because starting a fire from scratch was significantly more difficult than maintaining one that was already burning. Fire-starting methods in the Viking Age included striking steel against flint to create sparks that could ignite tinder, or using a bow drill to create friction-generated heat. Both methods required skill, patience, good materials, and favorable conditions. In wet weather, or if your tinder was damp, starting a fire could take considerable time and effort. Much simpler to keep the fire burning low overnight, banked with ashes or turf to slow combustion, then revive it in the morning by exposing the coals and adding kindling. There was also a social and almost spiritual significance to maintaining the hearth fire. In Norse culture, the hearth was associated with the household gods and the prosperity of the family. Letting the fire go out completely was considered unlucky at best and actively dangerous at worst, potentially inviting misfortune or showing disrespect to the protective spirits of the home. When a family moved to a new longhouse, they would traditionally carry embers from their old hearth to start the fire in their new one, maintaining continuity and bringing the blessing and protection of the household spirits with them. This wasn't just superstition, though it certainly was that. It was also practical, since starting a fire in the new location from scratch was inconvenient, and having a reliable source of fire to bring with you made the process considerably easier. So picture yourself sitting near the hearth on a long winter evening, close enough to feel its warmth, but not so close that sparks are a danger. The fire has been burning since morning, carefully maintained and fed throughout the day. Above you, smoke drifts through the rafters, carrying the smell of burning wood or peat or whatever fuel the household has available. Around you, other family members are gathered in the circle of firelight, their faces illuminated in that particular way that only firelight creates, all shadows and flickering highlights. Someone is cooking something in a pot suspended over the fire, and the smell competes with the ever-present smoke. A child asks to hear a story, and someone begins to speak, their words mixing with the crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. This is the center of Viking life, for better or worse, and everyone present understands that this fire, this hearth, this gathering is what stands between them and the deadly cold of the northern winter, waiting just beyond those thick turf walls. Chapter 3, where everyone slept, and yes, everyone could hear everything. Now that we've established where people spent their waking hours and how they managed to not freeze to death, let's talk about sleeping arrangements, which were exactly as awkward and lacking in privacy as you're probably imagining. The concept of having your own bedroom, or even your own bed, was a luxury that simply didn't exist for the vast majority of Viking-age Scandinavians. Instead, sleeping was a communal activity that happened in designated areas of the longhouse, and if you were hoping for any kind of personal space or quiet time, well, you'd chosen the wrong century and the wrong culture to be born into. The primary sleeping areas in most longhouses were platforms or benches that ran along the long walls of the building, on either side of the central hearth. These weren't beds in any sense that we'd recognize today. They were more like elevated platforms made of wood, often built right into the structure of the longhouse itself. Picture a wide bench, maybe 2 feet off the ground, and anywhere from 3 to 6 feet deep, running along each side of the building for much of its length. These platforms served multiple purposes during the day. They were workspaces where people sat to do handwork. They were seating for meals. They were storage areas. But at night, they transformed into sleeping spaces for most of the household. The platforms were typically covered with whatever materials the family could afford or produce that might make sleeping on a wooden plank slightly less miserable. Straw or dried grass was the most basic option, providing at least some cushioning and insulation from the cold wood beneath. Wealthier families might have mattresses of sorts, which were essentially large cloth sacks stuffed with straw, feathers if you were quite well off, or wool if you were somewhere in between. These weren't the neat, tufted mattresses we'd recognize today. They were lumpy, shifting, probably bug-infested sacks that needed to be restuffed regularly and replaced periodically when they became too compressed or disgusting to be functional. On top of whatever mattress or padding existed, people slept under blankets and furs. Wool blankets were common, as sheep were abundant throughout Scandinavia, and wool production was a major part of household textile work. These blankets were thick, heavy things, often woven in the household from the family's own sheep, and they were remarkably warm when properly made. Animal furs, bear, wolf, reindeer, seal, whatever was locally available and had been successfully hunted, provided additional warmth and were status symbols as well. A household with several good bearskins displayed wealth and hunting prowess. A household where everyone slept under wool blankets and nothing else was clearly of more modest means, though still adequately equipped to survive the winter if the blankets were good quality. Pillows existed, though again, don't picture anything from a modern bedroom. Viking Age pillows were often just cloth bags stuffed with whatever soft material was available: wool, feathers, moss, more straw, rags, whatever might provide some minimal cushioning for your head. Many people probably just folded up an extra piece of clothing or used their arm and called it good enough, because dedicating materials to a dedicated pillow was a luxury that not everyone could justify when those materials might be needed for more critical purposes. The sleeping platforms were not assigned one person per platform, obviously, because there simply wasn't that much space. People slept next to each other, often quite literally pressed together, which provided additional warmth through shared body heat, but also meant that privacy was utterly non-existent. A typical family sleeping arrangement might have parents sleeping together in one section of the platform, children arranged in another section, possibly some elderly relatives in yet another section, and thralls or servants sleeping in the less desirable spots, maybe the ends of the platforms where it was coldest, or on the floor, or in the storage areas at the ends of the longhouse, where they'd be sharing space with whatever animals had been brought inside for the winter. Let's pause and really think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a person living in this longhouse, you went to sleep listening to the breathing, snoring, coughing, and various other bodily sounds of everyone else in the household. If someone needed to get up in the night to use the bathroom, and we'll get to bathroom arrangements shortly, but spoiler alert, they were not pleasant. Everyone in their general vicinity would be disturbed. If a baby cried, which babies have been doing since the dawn of humanity, everyone heard it. If a couple wanted to engage in marital relations, everyone knew about it. If someone was sick, their illness was a public affair. If someone had a nightmare, the whole household might be awakened by it. This is the part where I remind you that this wasn't considered unusual or problematic by Viking Age standards. Privacy as we understand it, the expectation that you should be able to be alone, to have personal space, to conduct your private affairs without an audience, was simply not a concept that most people had any experience with. You lived your entire life surrounded by other people. You were born in a room full of people, you slept in a space full of people, you worked surrounded by people, you ate with people, and you eventually died with people attending you. Being truly alone was probably a rare and possibly unsettling experience for most Vikings, something that happened only when you were out hunting or traveling, and even then you were likely with companions. The sleeping platforms in many longhouses also featured dividers or partitions, though these varied enormously in their construction and effectiveness. In wealthier households, there might be wooden screens or carved posts that marked off sections of the platform, creating semi-private sleeping areas that at least gave the illusion of separation, even if they didn't do much to block sound. These partitions might be decorated with carvings or painted designs, turning them into displays of wealth and craftsmanship, as well as functional dividers. In more modest households, fabric curtains might be hung from the rafters to create similar divisions, though these were probably only drawn at night and were made from whatever cloth the household could spare from other uses. Some longhouses, particularly those of wealthy chieftains, featured separate bed closets or sleeping chambers partitioned off from the main hall. These were small rooms, barely large enough for a sleeping platform and perhaps a small amount of storage, but they represented a significant increase in privacy for whoever was important enough to claim one. The head of the household and his wife might sleep in such a chamber, while everyone else slept in the main hall. This wasn't common, though. Most people, including people of fairly significant social standing, slept in the communal sleeping area and accepted it as normal. The sleeping platforms also served as one of the primary storage areas in the longhouse, because space was always at a premium and every area needed to serve multiple functions. Under the sleeping platforms, in the space between the platform and the floor, families stored all manner of things: extra clothing and textiles, tools that weren't in daily use, food stores, barrels of preserved goods, chests containing valuables, and probably a rotating cast of items that didn't have a better place to be. This storage was relatively protected from the damp of the earth floor and out of the way of daily traffic, though it meant that accessing stored items might require moving someone's bedding or waiting until people weren't actively sleeping to dig around underneath the platform. Bedbugs, fleas, lice, and various other parasites were constant companions in Viking Age sleeping arrangements, as they were in most pre-modern sleeping situations anywhere in the world. The combination of many warm bodies in close proximity, textile materials that were rarely, if ever, washed, straw or other organic bedding materials, and animals living in close proximity to humans created an ideal environment for parasites to thrive. People attempted various methods to control them: herbs scattered in the bedding, periodic replacement of straw, cleaning of wool blankets when weather permitted, even fumigation by building fires that produce particularly acrid smoke. But none of these methods were particularly effective by modern standards. You simply accepted that you'd be sharing your sleeping space with insects and did your best to minimize the misery they caused. Temperature regulation during sleep was a constant challenge and varied dramatically by season. In summer, the longhouse might actually become uncomfortably warm, particularly near the hearth, and particularly if the weather was hot and the fire needed to be kept burning for cooking or other purposes. The sleeping platforms near the walls would be slightly cooler, but the trade-off was being farther from the light and social activity of the hearth area. In winter, the temperature gradient was extreme. Warm near the fire, progressively colder as you moved toward the walls, and genuinely cold in the corners farthest from the hearth. The best sleeping spots in winter were close enough to the fire to benefit from its heat, but not so close that sparks were a danger. These prime locations were undoubtedly allocated based on social hierarchy, with the most important family members getting the warmest spots, and everyone else making do with what was left. Children in Viking Age longhouses probably slept in family groups with their parents when they were young, then graduated to sleeping with their siblings or other children in the household as they got older. Very young infants might sleep in cradles, which were simple wooden boxes that could be rocked to soothe a fussy baby, though these took up valuable space and weren't used any longer than necessary. There's evidence that some cradles were suspended from the rafters, which would have the advantage of keeping the baby off the cold floor and potentially away from wandering animals, but would also require careful construction to ensure the whole thing didn't come crashing down in the middle of the night. Elderly or infirm members of the household might be given sleeping spots that were easier to access. Perhaps lower platforms or areas closer to the hearth where the warmth would help with aching joints and age-related frailty. But there were limits to what accommodations could be made in a space where every square foot served multiple purposes, and too many people needed to fit into too small an area. If you became disabled to the point where you couldn't navigate the normal sleeping arrangements, your options were limited. Perhaps you slept on the floor near the fire. Perhaps family members carried you to and from your sleeping spot. Perhaps, and this is the harsh reality of pre-modern life, you didn't survive long enough for it to become a major problem. The daily routine of preparing the sleeping areas was probably a task that fell to women and children in the household. During the day, bedding needed to be folded or rolled up to convert the sleeping platforms back into workspaces and seating. In good weather, blankets and furs might be taken outside to air out and be beaten to remove dirt and parasites, though this probably didn't happen as often as we might hope. Straw bedding needed to be replaced when it became too compressed or too foul, which meant someone needed to have gathered fresh straw during the harvest season and stored it somewhere dry for this purpose. The sleeping area needed to be swept to remove debris, crumbs from the evening meal, and whatever else had accumulated during the day's activities. At night, the process reversed. Bedding was unrolled or unfolded, pillows were placed, and people claimed their sleeping spots in whatever order the household hierarchy dictated. There was probably a fairly set routine to this, with everyone knowing where they were supposed to sleep and what order things needed to happen in to avoid chaos. Imagine trying to coordinate 30 people all preparing for bed in the same large room, with only firelight to see by and no alarm clocks to coordinate when everyone should start getting ready. It must have been like herding cats, except the cats are tired people of all ages who've been working all day and probably aren't in the mood for negotiation about whose turn it is to sleep in the warmer spot. The transition from waking activities to sleeping time was probably gradual rather than sudden. As darkness fell and the fire began to be banked for the night, work that required good light would cease. People would finish their evening meal, complete whatever evening tasks were necessary, and gradually migrate toward their sleeping areas. Stories might be told around the fire, the oral tradition that preserved history and mythology and family genealogy. Songs might be sung. News might be shared about the day's events or plans discussed for tomorrow's work. Eventually, people would begin to settle down. The fire would be reduced to coals, and the longhouse would transition into its nighttime state. Still not truly quiet, because 30 people sleeping in one space are never quiet, but quieter than the daytime bustle. And then, after a night of sleeping in close quarters with your entire extended family, some animals, and the generous population of insects, you'd wake up and do it all again. Was it comfortable? By modern standards, absolutely not. Was it normal? Entirely. Did anyone complain? Probably constantly, because humans have been complaining about their sleeping arrangements since we moved into caves, but there wasn't much to be done about it. This was life in a Viking longhouse, where personal space was measured in inches. Privacy was something that happened to other people in other times. And a good night's sleep meant simply waking up in the morning without having frozen to death or been crushed by a collapsing roof beam. Chapter 4. Cooking, Eating and Food Storage, How 30 People Got Fed Every Day. Let's talk about food, because nothing drives home the reality of Viking longhouse life quite like understanding the enormous amount of work required to feed a household of 20, 30 or more people 3 times a day, every day, for an entire year. This wasn't a situation where you could call for delivery or run to the grocery store when supplies ran low. Every single calorie that every person in that longhouse consumed had to be grown, hunted, gathered, caught, preserved, stored, retrieved from storage, prepared, and cooked using only the technology and resources immediately available to the household. It was a cycle of constant labor that occupied the time and energy of multiple people in the household essentially year-round, and failure at any step in the process could mean hunger or even starvation when winter came. The cooking itself primarily happened at the Central Hearth, which, as we've already established, was the only source of heat in the building, and therefore the only place where you could cook food unless you wanted to eat everything cold, which in Viking Scandinavia was not a particularly appealing prospect for large portions of the year. The cooking equipment was relatively simple but effective. Iron pots and cauldrons that could be suspended over the fire, flat stones that could be heated and used as griddles, spits for roasting meat, and various smaller tools for specific tasks. Iron cookware was valuable and well maintained, often passed down through generations, because replacing it required either the money to purchase new pieces or access to a blacksmith who could forge them. The primary cooking pot in most households was a large iron cauldron suspended over the fire by a chain attached to a crossbeam in the roof or to an adjustable iron mechanism that allowed the height of the pot to be changed to control cooking temperature. This cauldron was probably in use almost constantly during waking hours, containing whatever was being prepared for the next meal. Stews were common, because you could throw in whatever ingredients were available: preserved meat, grains, root vegetables, herbs, dried fish, whatever the household had. Add water or broth and let it simmer for hours while people attended to other work. The result wasn't always particularly appetizing by modern standards, but it was hot, filling and efficient in terms of fuel use and labor. Porridge or gruel was another staple, made from whatever grains were available: barley, oats, rye in some regions, cooked with water or milk until it reached the consistency of thick soup. This was served for breakfast in many households, providing substantial calories to fuel a day of hard physical labor. It was probably not exciting or flavorful, particularly by the end of winter, when it might be one of the few foods still available in any quantity. But excitement wasn't really the point. The point was to fill stomachs with something that would provide energy for work, and porridge accomplished that goal efficiently and economically. Bread was baked when circumstances permitted, though this was more common in some regions than others, depending on grain availability and baking facilities. Flatbreads cooked on hot stones near the fire were probably the most common type, as they didn't require an oven and could be made relatively quickly. Raised breads required sourdough starters or other leavening agents, and ideally needed an actual oven to bake properly, which not all longhouses had. Some wealthier households or small communities had separate baking houses with proper ovens, but for many families, bread making was a more occasional activity rather than a daily one, and flatbreads were the norm. Meat, when available, was roasted on spits over the fire, boiled in the cauldron, or prepared in various other ways depending on the type of meat and the household's preferences. Fresh meat was a seasonal thing for most people. Animals were slaughtered primarily in the fall to reduce the number of animals that needed to be fed through the winter, providing a brief period of fresh meat before everything needed to be preserved for later use. During the rest of the year, meat was eaten preserved, salted, smoked, dried, or some combination of these methods. Preserved meat is salty, tough, and often needs to be soaked before cooking to make it remotely palatable. But it's meat, and meat was a valuable source of protein and calories. Fish was probably more common than meat in many Viking households, particularly in coastal areas or near rivers and lakes where fishing was productive. Fresh fish during the fishing season was prepared much like meat, roasted, boiled, or cooked in stews. But the majority of fish was preserved, usually by drying, sometimes by smoking, occasionally by salting if salt was available in sufficient quantities. Dried fish is remarkably durable and can be stored for months or even years if kept dry. But it requires rehydration and often extensive cooking to become something you'd actually want to eat. Imagine chewing on what is essentially a fish-flavored piece of leather until your jaw aches, and you're approaching the reality of eating poorly prepared dried fish. Dairy products were hugely important in the Viking diet, probably more so than meat for most people. Cows, sheep, and goats were kept for their milk, which was processed into various products that could be stored and consumed throughout the year. Fresh milk in summer was a luxury that didn't last long before it spoiled. More commonly, milk was processed into products with better keeping qualities. Butter, which could be preserved in barrels of brine or in cool bog water. Cheese, which was made in large quantities during the summer milk flush and stored for winter. Skyr, a cultured dairy product similar to yogurt that was a major protein source in Iceland. And whey, the liquid left after cheese making, which could be used in cooking or fed to animals. Vegetables in the Viking diet were primarily root vegetables and others that could be stored through winter. Onions, carrots, cabbage, turnips, beets, peas, and beans. These were grown in the household garden during summer and carefully harvested and stored in the fall. Fresh vegetables were eaten while available, but most were stored for winter use, kept in cool, dark areas of the longhouse or in separate storage buildings if the household had them. Root cellars or underground storage pits helped preserve vegetables longer, though spoilage was always a concern. Finding that a significant portion of your winter vegetable supply had rotted was a potential disaster that could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and severe vitamin deficiency over the long winter months. Fruits were available seasonally. Apples in some regions, various berries in summer that were eaten fresh, dried for winter, or processed into preserves if honey was available to make jam. Nuts, where available, were gathered and stored as a source of protein and fat. Wild plants were foraged for food and medicine. Certain mushrooms, edible greens in spring, herbs for flavoring and healing. This required detailed knowledge of the local environment and what was safe to eat, knowledge that was passed down through generations and that children began learning almost as soon as they could walk. Herbs and flavorings were used to make food more palatable, though the range available was limited compared to what we're used to today. Onions and leeks were common and could be grown easily. Wild herbs like thyme, dill, and mustard were gathered or cultivated. Salt was precious and expensive, obtained through trade or, in coastal areas, by evaporating seawater, but it was essential for food preservation. Honey was the only sweetener available and was rare enough that it was generally reserved for special occasions or for making mead, not used casually to sweeten everyday food. The actual process of cooking was skilled work, usually done by women in the household, though certainly men knew how to cook basic meals and would have done so when necessary. Managing a fire at the right temperature, knowing when food was properly cooked, preparing multiple dishes to be ready at the same time, making food palatable from unpromising ingredients. All of this required experience and skill. Someone who was good at cooking could make the household's food supply stretch further and taste better, which had real implications for the well-being and morale of everyone living there. Meals were communal affairs, eaten around the fire with people sitting on the sleeping platforms or on stools. Dishes were simple: wooden bowls and trenchers, perhaps some ceramic vessels, spoons carved from wood or bone. Forks weren't used. People ate with their hands and with spoons. Knives were personal items that everyone carried and used for cutting food, defending themselves, and various other daily tasks. Drinking vessels were made from wood, ceramic or horn, and would be refilled from a shared pitcher or barrel. Everyone drinking from the same supply was normal, and the concept of individual beverages chosen according to personal preference was not a thing. The household probably ate twice a day, typically. A morning meal after the day's work had begun, and an evening meal after the main work of the day was done. There might be snacking in between if food was available and people were hungry, but formal meals were not the constant availability of food that we're used to today. When food was scarce, particularly at the end of winter before new supplies became available in spring, people ate less and made do with smaller portions. Children and working-age adults might get priority, while elderly people who were no longer productive workers might eat less. It was a brutal calculus, but one that was sometimes necessary for the survival of the household as a whole. Food storage was a constant concern, and a major architectural feature of the longhouse. Under the sleeping platforms, as we mentioned, but also in the end sections of the building, hanging from the rafters, in barrels and chests and bags, in separate storehouses if the household had them. Food was everywhere, in various stages of preservation, all of it needing to be protected from spoilage, pests, theft and damp. The household's entire food supply for the year needed to fit somewhere, be accessible when needed, and remain edible until it was consumed. This was a logistical challenge that required careful planning and constant vigilance. Barrels were essential for storing liquids and preserved foods, salted meat or fish, butter and brine, sour whey, various other products. These barrels needed to be well made and watertight, which meant cooperage was a skilled trade and good barrels were valuable items. Cloth sacks held grains and dried goods, though they needed to be hung up or stored in ways that kept them away from mice and rats, which were always interested in accessing the household's food supply. Clay pots and jars stored smaller quantities of specialty items. Baskets held various dried goods. Meat and fish hung from the rafters, slowly accumulating more smoke and becoming more preserved as the weeks passed. Keeping track of all these stores, knowing what you had, rationing appropriately to ensure food lasted until new supplies became available, noticing when something was starting to spoil so it could be used before it became inedible. This was probably a job that fell to the woman of the household, the housewife, who had overall responsibility for managing the household's domestic affairs. It required a detailed mental inventory of supplies, an understanding of how long different foods would keep, and the judgment to know when to use something and when to save it for later when it might be more desperately needed. In lean times, creativity became essential. If grain supplies were running low, bread might be made with bark flour mixed in. Yes, ground up tree bark, which is edible if not particularly nutritious or pleasant tasting. If meat was scarce, every part of any animal slaughtered was used. Organ meats, blood for blood sausage, bones boiled for broth and then broken open for marrow, skin and connective tissue rendered into gelatin. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant hunger. This is the kind of resourcefulness that comes from living close enough to the edge of survival that you can't afford to throw away anything that might have caloric value. So picture the evening meal on a winter night in the longhouse. The large cauldron is hanging over the fire, full of stew that's been cooking for hours, preserved meat that's been soaked to remove some of the salt, root vegetables from the winter stores, barley or other grains to thicken it, herbs to give it some flavor. All of it simmering together into something that's more fuel than fine dining, but will fill hungry stomachs. Someone ladles portions into wooden bowls, which are passed around to the assembled household. People eat with their fingers and with spoons, dipping flatbread into the stew to soak up the liquid. There's small beer to drink, weak enough that it won't intoxicate, but safer than untreated water and containing some calories. The meal is hot and filling, even if it tastes more or less like every other meal this winter. People eat, and then the bowls are collected to be cleaned, the fire is tended, and life continues in the smoky warmth of the longhouse, sustained by food that was months or even years in the making from field to fire to stomach. Chapter 5. The hierarchy of daily life. Who did what and why that mattered. Every longhouse was a complex social structure with clearly defined hierarchies, roles, and expectations that governed who did what work, where people sat, who spoke when, and essentially every other aspect of daily life. This wasn't a democracy or a commune where everyone had equal say in decisions and equal access to resources. It was a stratified social system that ranged from the free head of household with full rights and authority down to thralls who had essentially no rights at all, with various gradations of status in between. Understanding this hierarchy is essential to understanding how a longhouse actually functioned, because the social structure determined everything from who slept in the warmest spots, to who ate the best portions of food, to whose opinions mattered when decisions needed to be made. At the top of the household hierarchy was the male head of household, the bondi if he was a free farmer, or the jarl if he was a member of the noble class. This person had ultimate authority over the household and everyone in it. He made decisions about when crops would be planted, which animals would be slaughtered, whether the household would participate in trading expeditions or raids, how resources would be allocated, and essentially every other matter of significance. His word was law within his household, backed by social expectations, legal authority, and ultimately by force if necessary. This doesn't mean he was a tyrant who made every decision unilaterally. A wise householder would consult with his wife and other senior household members before making major decisions. But the final authority was unquestionably his. The wife of the household head held the second position in the hierarchy and had substantial authority over the domestic sphere. She managed the household's day-to-day operations, overseeing food preparation and preservation, managing textile production, supervising the work of other women and thralls in the household, maintaining the household supplies, and essentially ensuring that the domestic side of the operation ran smoothly. She carried the keys to the household storage areas, which was both a practical responsibility and the symbol of her authority. The keys might be worn on a chain at her belt or kept on a keyring, and they represented her control over the household's resources. Without her cooperation, the household could not function effectively, which gave her substantial practical power even in a patriarchal society. Below the household head and his wife were their children, whose status and roles varied depending on their age, gender, and birth order. Sons, particularly the oldest son, who would eventually inherit the household and its lands, held more authority than daughters. Older children held more authority than younger ones. Boys were trained in the skills they'd need as adult men: farming, animal husbandry, weapon use, navigation if they were in a coastal household, trading, and all the other skills that defined male competence in Viking society. Girls were trained in the skills they'd need as adult women: textile production, food preparation and preservation, household management, childcare, and the social skills needed to manage a household effectively. Other free relatives might also live in the longhouse: elderly parents of the household head or his wife, unmarried siblings, perhaps a married son who hadn't yet established his own household. These people were free and had rights, but they were dependents of the household head to varying degrees. An elderly father who had handed over control of the farm to his son might still be consulted on important decisions and treated with respect due to his age and experience, but he was no longer in charge. An unmarried sister living in her brother's household would be expected to contribute labor and would be supported by the household, but she wouldn't have the authority that a married woman had in her own home. Then we come to the unfree members of the household, the thralls, slaves, who occupied the bottom rung of the social hierarchy and whose lives were qualitatively different from those of free people in almost every respect. Thralls could be people captured in raids, people sold into slavery due to debt or crime, children born to thrall parents, or people who had ended up in slavery through various other misfortunes. They had no legal rights, were considered property, could be bought and sold, and their labor belonged entirely to their owner. In practical terms, this meant they did the hardest, most unpleasant work, had no say in decisions, ate after the free members of the household had eaten, and received smaller or lower quality portions, slept in the least desirable spots, and had essentially no control over their own lives. The work assigned to thralls was the work that no one else wanted to do. Mucking out animal stalls, the most tedious and backbreaking agricultural labor, hauling water, emptying chamber pots if such things were used, processing the most unpleasant aspects of food preparation. Thralls did some of the same work that free people did, but they did more of it, the worst versions of it, and without any of the social standing or eventual reward that free people could expect from their labor. A free person doing hard agricultural work was working their own land or their family's land, building something for themselves and their children. A thrall doing the same work was building wealth for their owner, with no hope that their situation would improve. Treatment of thralls varied depending on the individual household and the temperament of the owners. Some households probably treated their thralls relatively well, providing adequate food, not inflicting unnecessary cruelty, perhaps even developing personal relationships of a sort. Other households were undoubtedly brutal, treating thralls as barely human tools whose suffering was of no concern. The sagas mention thralls being killed by their owners for infractions, or sometimes just because the owner was in a bad mood, which tells you something about both the legal status of thralls and the casual brutality that could characterize their treatment. It's important to note that slavery was economically significant in Viking Age Scandinavia. Thralls represented a substantial portion of the labor force in many households, particularly wealthier ones. A household with several thralls could accomplish more work, produce more goods, and thus accumulate more wealth than a household without thralls. This created a feedback loop where wealth allowed you to purchase thralls, whose labor generated more wealth, which allowed you to purchase more thralls. The accumulation of thralls was both a result of wealth and a means of generating it. The daily work in a longhouse was divided along lines of status and gender, with clear expectations about who did what. Free men did outdoor work that required strength and skill. Ploughing, heavy construction, hunting, fishing, working with animals, trading, and of course fighting when necessary. Free women did work associated with the household and textile production. Cooking, food preservation, spinning, weaving, sewing, childcare, managing the household's resources, dairy production, and probably much of the garden work. Children helped with all of the above, learning the skills they'd need as adults and providing valuable labor once they were old enough to be useful. Thralls did whatever they were told to do, which was usually the hardest, most unpleasant versions of all the work that needed doing. The spatial organization of the Longhouse reflected and reinforced this social hierarchy. The high seat, a specially designated spot near the center of the hall, was where the head of the household sat. This wasn't just any seat, it was symbolically important, often elaborately carved, and sitting in it was a claim to authority over the household and everyone in it. The wife would sit in the corresponding position on the other side of the hall. Other free members of the household sat in order of their status, with the most important people closest to the high seat and the least important free people farther away. Thralls probably didn't sit at meals, at least not until the free people had finished eating, or they sat in the least desirable spots, or they ate standing up, or they ate after everyone else from whatever was left. Meal times were when this hierarchy was most visible and most actively performed. The best portions of food went to the most important people. The head of household got the choicest cut of meat, the first serving of anything special. His wife received similar treatment. Children and other dependents received portions appropriate to their status. Thralls got the scraps, the less desirable parts of the animal, smaller portions, and they received them only after the free people had eaten their fill. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, or not entirely. It was a daily reinforcement of the social order, a physical demonstration of who mattered and who didn't. The same hierarchy governed speaking rights, particularly in formal or semi-formal contexts. The head of household spoke first and last. His opinions carried the most weight, and interrupting him would have been a serious breach of etiquette. His wife could speak with authority on matters within her domain, and her opinions on household management would be given serious weight. Other free adults could offer opinions, particularly if they were respected for their age or experience. Children were expected to be quiet unless spoken to, and thralls essentially had no right to speak in any formal context unless directly questioned. Decision-making in the Longhouse was theoretically hierarchical, but probably more consultative in practice, at least for major decisions. A wise household head would consult with his wife before making decisions about household management because she had more detailed knowledge of resources and supplies and day-to-day operations. He might consult with his elderly father if that person was still alive and living in the household, benefiting from decades of experience. He might discuss decisions with other free adults in the household whose opinions he valued. But consulting didn't mean democratic decision-making. It meant gathering information and perspectives before making a decision that remained his alone to make. Conflict resolution within the household was also governed by hierarchy. If two people of equal or similar status had a dispute, it might be mediated by the household head, who would hear both sides and render a judgment that both parties were expected to accept. If the dispute was between people of unequal status, the person of higher status generally prevailed, unless their behavior was so egregious that it couldn't be ignored. If a thrall had a complaint against a free person, well, good luck with that. Unless the thrall could convince someone with authority that a genuine injustice had occurred, and that person cared enough to do something about it, the thrall had essentially no recourse. The household hierarchy extended beyond just the immediate family and thralls, to include various other people who might be temporarily or permanently attached to the household. A travelling craftsman staying in the Longhouse while he completed work for the household would be treated as an honoured guest, given a good seat at meals and respected for his skills. A visiting relative would be shown hospitality appropriate to their relationship and status. A foster child sent to live with a household as part of an alliance between families would be integrated into the household's hierarchy at a level appropriate to their family status and the terms of the fostering agreement. All of these relationships had expectations attached to them. Unwritten but clearly understood rules about how people should behave and how they should be treated. This hierarchical structure wasn't unique to the Vikings. Similar patterns existed in most pre-modern agricultural societies, where households were the basic unit of production and social organization. But understanding it is crucial to understanding what life in a Viking longhouse actually felt like for the people living it. If you were the household head, you had authority and responsibility in roughly equal measure, and your decisions shaped the lives of everyone depending on you. If you were his wife, you had substantial practical power, but operated within constraints imposed by gender expectations and ultimately your husband's authority. If you were a child, you were in training for adult roles, but had essentially no autonomy. If you were a thrall, you had no rights, no freedom, and no reasonable hope that your situation would improve. And every day was a matter of endurance until you died or were freed, which for most thralls meant until you died. The psychological weight of this hierarchy, knowing your place, accepting it, performing your role day after day, must have been substantial, particularly for those on the lower rungs. But it was also familiar, expected, the way the world worked as far as anyone knew. Questioning the fundamental structure of society wasn't something most people did. Not because they were stupid or lacked imagination, but because alternative models weren't readily available or even conceivable for most people. This was how things were, how they had always been, how they would continue to be. You played your assigned role, fulfilled your obligations, claimed your rights when you had them, and accepted that some people had authority over you while you had authority over others, or, if you were a thrall, over no one at all. So when you picture life in that longhouse, don't imagine a cozy commune where everyone was equal and decisions were made by consensus. Picture instead a carefully ordered social structure where everyone knew their place. The hierarchy was maintained through daily practice and occasional enforcement, and stepping outside your assigned role could result in consequences ranging from social censure to physical punishment, depending on the severity of the transgression and your place in the hierarchy. It was orderly in its way, and it worked well enough to support a complex society across harsh environments for centuries. But it was also rigid, often unfair, and for those at the bottom, it was a life of hard labor and little hope, with no escape except death. Chapter 6. Hygiene, Waste Management, and the Practical Realities of Medieval Cleanliness. Now we arrive at one of those topics that really separates historical reality from the sanitized versions we see in movies and television shows. Personal hygiene and waste management in a Viking longhouse. This is where we need to set aside any romantic notions about the past and confront the simple fact that by modern standards, Viking Age Scandinavia was, to put it delicately, extremely smelly. Not because the Vikings were uniquely dirty or didn't care about cleanliness. They actually had better hygiene practices than many of their European contemporaries, but because the technology and resources available to them made true cleanliness, as we understand it, essentially impossible to achieve and maintain. Let's start with bathing, because there's a persistent myth that medieval people never bathed, which isn't quite accurate, but also isn't entirely wrong, depending on how you define bathing. The Vikings actually had a stronger bathing culture than many other medieval Europeans, influenced partly by their contact with Islamic cultures through trade routes and partly by their own traditions. Archaeological evidence and written sources tell us that Vikings bathed at least weekly, which was considerably more often than many of their Christian neighbours, who viewed frequent bathing with suspicion as potentially immoral or unhealthy. Saturday was specifically designated as bathing day in Old Norse, laugardaga, literally washing day, and this tradition was important enough that it's mentioned in multiple historical sources. But here's the thing. Bathing in a Viking longhouse wasn't the sort of leisurely hot shower or bubble bath that we're familiar with. It was a production that required substantial advanced preparation, significant quantities of water that all had to be hauled from a well or stream, fuel to heat that water, and a container large enough to bathe in, which most households probably didn't have. The most common form of bathing was probably more of a sponge bath situation, heating water in a pot over the fire, than using cloths or sponges to wash yourself section by section while standing near the fire, where it was warm enough that you wouldn't immediately freeze. Thorough, whole-body bathing probably happened less frequently, perhaps in a wooden tub if the household had one, or in a bathhouse if there was one nearby, or in a river or lake during warmer months when the risk of hypothermia was lower. Some wealthier households and communities had dedicated bathhouses, which were separate structures specifically designed for bathing and an important part of Norse culture. These functioned something like saunas. A fire would heat stones, water would be poured over the hot stones to create steam, and people would sit in the heated space, sweating and washing. Birch branches were used to stimulate circulation by gently beating the skin, which sounds medieval and bizarre, but is actually still practiced in Scandinavian sauna culture today. After sweating profusely in the hot bathhouse, people might rinse with cool water or, if they were particularly hardy, jump into a cold stream or lake. This was genuinely effective at removing dirt and oil from skin, and the Vikings who had regular access to bathhouses were probably cleaner than most of their contemporaries. But not everyone had access to a bathhouse, and not everyone could afford the time and resources to bathe properly every week, particularly during the harsh winter months when hauling and heating water was substantially more difficult, and the risk of getting chilled was genuinely dangerous. So the reality was probably that bathing frequency varied considerably based on wealth, season, and individual circumstances. Some people bathed regularly and took pride in their cleanliness. Others bathed much less frequently, particularly during winter, and probably smelled strongly of body odor, smoke, and whatever work they'd been doing. When you consider that most people wore wool clothing that wasn't washed regularly and slept in bedding that was also rarely cleaned, personal cleanliness was always a losing battle against the general dirtiness of the environment. Hair care was another aspect of Viking hygiene that's interesting, because it reveals that Vikings did care about their appearance and cleanliness, even if they couldn't achieve modern standards. Both men and women typically had long hair, and maintaining it required regular combing to remove tangles and the various parasites that inevitably took up residence. Combs made from bone or wood have been found in large numbers at Viking archaeological sites, sometimes carved with intricate designs, indicating that they were valued possessions. Hair was probably washed occasionally using water and perhaps soap if the household made or could afford soap. Though washing long hair in winter when you couldn't reliably dry it by a fire would have been unpleasant and potentially dangerous. Lice were absolutely endemic in Viking society, as they were in essentially all pre-modern societies. The combination of long hair, infrequent washing, close living quarters, and lack of effective treatments meant that virtually everyone had lice at some point. And many people probably had them constantly. Nitpicking, Literally going through someone's hair to remove lice eggs was a regular activity, often done socially as people sat together in the evening. Finding lice in your hair wasn't shameful or considered a sign of exceptional filth. It was just a normal part of life that everyone dealt with. The constant itching, the sensation of insects crawling on your scalp, the bite marks, all of this was so common that it probably barely registered after a while. Just another minor physical discomfort in a life full of them. Dental hygiene is another area where we need to adjust our expectations significantly. Toothbrushes didn't exist, obviously. Toothpaste didn't exist. Regular dental care certainly didn't exist. What did exist were various improvised methods for cleaning teeth that were marginally better than nothing. Some people chewed on twigs with frayed ends that acted somewhat like brushes, removing food particles from between teeth. Others probably just used their fingers and water. Archaeological analysis of Viking-age teeth shows substantial wear, evidence of poor dental health, abscesses, and tooth loss. But interestingly, less tooth decay than you might expect. This is probably because the Viking diet contained much less sugar than modern diets. Honey was the only sweetener and was rare enough that most people didn't consume it regularly. Bad breath must have been nearly universal, caused by tooth decay, gum disease, poor digestion from dietary issues, and general lack of oral hygiene. But everyone had bad breath, so it was probably one of those things that you just didn't notice after a while, the same way you eventually stop smelling the smoke that fills the longhouse. The concept that breath should be fresh and minty wasn't part of the culture, and there's no evidence that people were particularly concerned about it. Now let's talk about what might be the most unpleasant aspect of longhouse hygiene: waste management, both human and animal. Toilet facilities in Viking longhouses were essentially non-existent inside the structure itself. There were no bathrooms, no toilets, no running water, no sewage systems. Instead, people used outhouses, small structures separate from the longhouse, usually just a simple shelter built over a pit where waste accumulated. Or they used chamber pots that were later emptied outside. Neither of these options was particularly pleasant, and in the middle of a winter night when it was freezing cold and possibly snowing, the temptation to hold it until morning must have been substantial. Chamber pots, when used, were simple ceramic or wooden containers that you urinated or defecated into, which then sat in the longhouse until someone, undoubtedly someone low in the household hierarchy, quite possibly a thrall, carried them outside to be emptied. Imagine you're trying to sleep, and someone 3 feet away from you is using a chamber pot. Everyone can hear it. Everyone knows what's happening, and then that pot, with its contents, sits there until morning. Privacy wasn't an option, and modesty was a luxury that the physical realities of longhouse life simply didn't permit. The outhouse, when you had to use it, meant going outside regardless of weather, walking some distance from the longhouse to where the structure was located, doing your business in the small, dark, cold, and intensely smelly shelter, then walking back. In summer, this was merely unpleasant. In winter, particularly during harsh storms or at night, it could be genuinely miserable and potentially dangerous. People definitely died from exposure after going outside to use the facilities in bad weather, particularly elderly or infirm people who couldn't move quickly or who became disoriented in a blizzard. This is not a joke or an exaggeration. Winter kills, and one of the ways it killed people was when they were most vulnerable and least prepared. The contents of the outhouse pit or chamber pots weren't wasted, because waste in an agricultural society was a valuable resource. Human excrement was composted and eventually spread on fields as fertilizer, completing a cycle where the nutrients from food return to the soil to grow more food. This is efficient and ecologically sound, but it also meant that the smell of human waste was a regular part of the agricultural environment during planting season when fields were being fertilized. Again, everyone was exposed to this smell regularly, so it presumably became less noticeable over time. But to modern sensibilities, the Viking Age countryside would have been an assault on the nose. Animal waste was an even more constant presence because animals lived in close proximity to humans, and in many cases actually inside the longhouse during winter. We'll talk more about this in the next chapter, but for now, just understand that animals defecate constantly and prodigiously, and cleaning up after them was a never-ending task. The areas of the longhouse where animals were kept would have been deeply unpleasant by modern standards, with accumulated manure that needed to be regularly shoveled out and spread on fields or composted. During winter, this might happen less frequently because going outside was difficult and unpleasant, which meant that waste accumulated in larger quantities before being removed. The floor of the longhouse deserves special mention as one of the most fundamentally unhygienic aspects of Viking domestic life. In most longhouses, the floor was simply packed earth, possibly mixed with clay or other materials to harden it, but fundamentally just dirt. This floor absorbed everything that fell on it: spilled food, spilled drinks, animal urine and feces, human bodily fluids, blood from butchering or injuries, and who knows what else. Fresh rushes or straw were spread over the floor periodically to cover the worst of the filth and provide some cushioning and insulation. But these floor coverings were replaced infrequently, maybe a few times per year, because producing or gathering enough material to cover the entire floor of a 60-foot longhouse was labor-intensive. What this meant in practice was that the floor covering became increasingly foul as time passed, absorbing moisture and organic matter, harboring insects and parasites, developing truly remarkable smells, and becoming slimy or crunchy depending on what had been spilled there. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age structures have found floor layers containing an absolutely staggering array of disgusting materials, compressed together over years or decades of accumulation. When new rushes were finally spread, they just covered the old ones, so you were essentially building up layers of biological material compressed underfoot. Walking on this floor would have been squelchy and unpleasant, and the smell rising from it must have been remarkable, even by the standards of people who were accustomed to living with smells we'd find intolerable. Menstruation was another aspect of female hygiene that had to be managed without the benefit of modern products. Women used cloth rags, possibly wool, folded and held in place with wrapping or belts, which absorbed menstrual blood and were then washed and reused. This was not particularly effective. Leaking was common, and the cloths needed to be changed frequently, which meant having enough clean cloths available and somewhere to wash and dry the used ones. In winter, when getting things clean and dry was difficult, this was particularly challenging. Menstruation wasn't hidden or treated as especially shameful in Norse society, probably because privacy didn't exist and everyone was aware of it regardless. But it was still uncomfortable, messy and inconvenient in ways that modern menstrual products have largely eliminated. Laundry was an infrequent and labor-intensive process that deserves attention because it had such significant implications for cleanliness. Washing clothes required hauling large quantities of water, heating that water over the fire, finding or making soap or other cleaning agents, soaking the clothes, beating them to remove dirt, rinsing them, then drying them. All of this took time and fuel and effort, particularly for wool garments which were heavy when wet and dried slowly. As a result, Clothes were worn for extended periods between washings, weeks or months rather than days. Undergarments might be washed more frequently than outer layers, but even that was relative. A single linen undertunic might be worn for a week or more before being washed, accumulating sweat, dead skin cells and body oils that gave it a distinctive smell and texture. Wool outer garments were rarely washed at all because wet wool is heavy, takes forever to dry, and can shrink or felt if not handled carefully. Instead, wool was aired out, brushed to remove surface dirt, and spot cleaned when necessary. The lanolin naturally present in wool provided some water and dirt resistance, but it also meant the garments retained odours and weren't truly clean in any meaningful sense. Everyone smelled like their unwashed wool clothing, which smelled like sheep, smoke, sweat, and whatever work they'd been doing. This was so universal that it was invisible. You smelled that way. Everyone else smelled that way. It was just how people smelled. Soap existed and was used, but it wasn't the mild, pleasant-smelling substance we're familiar with. Viking Age soap was made from animal fat and wood ash lye, a caustic substance that was effective at breaking down oils and dirt, but was harsh on skin and had a distinctive, unpleasant smell. Making soap required careful preparation of the lye, which involved soaking wood ashes in water and carefully collecting the resulting liquid, then rendering animal fat and combining the two in correct proportions while cooking them together. This was skilled work that produced a valuable product, but soap was precious enough that it wasn't used casually. You used soap for important washing tasks, not for daily hand washing or minor cleaning. Hand washing before meals or after using the toilet probably happened when it was convenient and when water was readily available, which was not as often as we might hope. In summer, when water was easily accessible and warm weather made washing less unpleasant, people probably washed their hands more frequently. In winter, when every drop of water had to be hauled from a well or melted from snow, and you didn't want to get your hands wet and chapped in the cold, hand washing probably happened less often. The concept of washing hands as disease prevention wasn't understood. Germ theory wouldn't be developed for another several centuries, so hand washing was more about removing visible dirt than about hygiene in the medical sense. Diseases related to poor hygiene were common, though people didn't understand the connection between cleanliness and health. Skin infections from minor wounds, intestinal parasites from contaminated food or water, respiratory infections spread by close living conditions, eye infections from smoke and dirt, and various other ailments were regular features of Viking Age life. Infant mortality was high, and while many factors contributed to this, poor hygiene certainly played a role. Adults built up some immunity through constant exposure, but they also just endured a level of chronic illness that would be considered intolerable today. So when you imagine yourself in that Viking longhouse, sitting near the hearth on a winter evening, understand that the smell is complex and intense. Smoke, obviously, but also unwashed human bodies. Wool clothing that hasn't been cleaned in months. The earthy smell of the packed dirt floor and turf walls. Animal waste from wherever animals are being kept. Cooking food that partially masks but doesn't eliminate the other odours, and probably a whiff of the chamber pot if someone's recently used it. Your skin is probably a bit grimy. Your hair hasn't been washed in a while, and you can feel its oily texture. Your clothes smell strongly of smoke and sweat, and you're probably itching from something. Lice, fleas, dry skin, or just irritation from the constant exposure to smoke. This is normal. This is what clean enough looks like in Viking Age Scandinavia. You're not dirty by the standards of your time and place, but by modern standards, you desperately need a shower, some deodorant, clean clothes, and probably a visit to a dentist. Chapter 7. Living with Animals. Why your roommates had 4 legs and no manners. One of the most distinctive and, to modern sensibilities, bizarre aspects of Viking Longhouse life was the practice of bringing animals indoors. Not as pets in the sense we understand them, but as valuable livestock that needed protection from predators and weather. This wasn't universal. Not every longhouse housed animals inside, and the practice varied by region, climate, and household wealth. But it was common enough that we need to understand what it meant to share your living space with cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and whatever other animals the household depended on for food, labor, and raw materials. This was practical and necessary from the Viking perspective, but it also meant accepting a level of smell, noise, and general unpleasantness that would drive most modern people absolutely insane within hours. Let's start with why this practice existed at all. Because from our modern perspective, where we have heated barns and effective animal shelters, bringing livestock into your living space seems unnecessary and actively unpleasant. But from the Viking perspective, particularly in the harsh climates of Norway, Iceland, and other northern regions, where winter temperatures could kill animals as easily as they could kill humans, protecting valuable livestock was literally a matter of household survival. A cow that froze to death in winter was a massive economic loss. You lost not just the meat, but the milk production, the ability to breed more cattle, the leather and other materials the animal would eventually provide. Losing multiple animals to a single harsh winter could devastate a household's economy for years. The architectural solution to this problem was to integrate animal housing directly into the longhouse structure, typically at one or both ends of the building. The human living area would be in the center section, with the hearth and sleeping platforms and all the domestic activity, while one or both end sections were partitioned off, sometimes with actual walls, sometimes just with a change in floor level or a partial barrier to house animals. This arrangement allowed the animals to benefit from the warmth generated by the central hearth, which radiated throughout the structure, while also allowing the animal's body heat to contribute to warming the building. It was, in its way, an efficient use of resources and space in a context where both were precious. The types of animals brought indoors varied by household and region, but cattle were probably the most common, particularly milk cows that were essential to the household's dairy production. A typical farming household might have anywhere from 2 to 10 cows, depending on their wealth and the amount of pasture available. These cows would spend summer months outdoors, grazing on available pasture, but would be brought into the longhouse when winter arrived and temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. Each cow requires a fair amount of space, roughly 6 to 8 feet of length and 3 to 4 feet of width, and produces a substantial quantity of manure daily. We're talking somewhere around 50 to 60 pounds of waste per cow per day, which in a winter that lasts 5 or 6 months adds up to literally tons of manure that needed to be managed somehow. Sheep and goats were also commonly housed indoors during winter, and they had their own set of advantages and challenges. They were smaller than cattle, so more animals could fit in a given space. But they were also more active and prone to wandering, which meant they needed to be more carefully confined. Sheep were absolutely essential to the Viking economy. They provided wool for textile production, milk for cheese and other dairy products, meat, leather, and basically everything the household needed from an animal except heavy labor. A household might easily have 20 or 30 sheep, all of which needed to be kept alive through the winter, which meant finding space for them in or near the longhouse. Pigs were sometimes kept as well, though they were less common than cattle or sheep in many regions because they required more grain in their diet and didn't provide the same range of useful products. But pork was valued, and pigs had the advantage of being able to eat household food scraps and convert them into meat, making them efficient recyclers of kitchen waste. The downside was that pigs are messy, smelly, and quite intelligent, which meant they were capable of causing chaos if not properly confined. A pig loose in the living section of a longhouse would be an absolute disaster, rooting through stored food, knocking things over, and generally creating havoc. Chickens were probably the most commonly kept birds, providing eggs during the laying season and meat when they stopped being productive. Chickens are relatively small and don't require much space, but they do require some form of shelter from predators and weather, so keeping them in the longhouse or in an attached structure made sense. The main issues with chickens were that they were noisy, they defecated frequently and indiscriminately, and they were prone to escaping from inadequate enclosures and ending up in areas of the longhouse where they weren't wanted. Nothing quite like being woken up by a chicken wandering across your sleeping platform, pecking at your face because it thinks you might have food. The physical arrangement of the animal quarters varied, but the basics were similar across most longhouses. The floor in the animal section was often lower than the human living area, creating a sort of sunken space that helped contain manure and also provided some drainage. This floor would be covered with straw or other bedding material that absorbed waste and provided cushioning for the animals. The animals were typically tied in place. Cattle would be tethered in stalls, sheep might be penned in a corner, to prevent them from wandering into the human living area or from fighting with each other. Feeding troughs or areas where food could be placed were built into the structure, allowing animals to be fed without having to let them loose. The smell in the animal section of the longhouse was, to put it mildly, intense. Imagine a barn that hasn't been cleaned in several weeks. Concentrate that smell into an enclosed space with limited ventilation. Add the smoke from the hearth drifting through, and you're approaching the reality. The combination of animal bodies, animal waste, rotting straw bedding, feed, and whatever else was present created an olfactory experience that would be overwhelming to modern noses, but was presumably just part of daily life for the Vikings. The smell would have permeated the entire longhouse to varying degrees, though it would be most intense in the animal sections and would diminish somewhat in the human living areas. The noise was another constant feature of living with livestock. Cows lowing, sheep bleating, chickens clucking, pigs grunting, and all the various other sounds that animals make. Eating, moving around, fighting with each other, responding to disturbances, created a constant background soundtrack. At night, when you were trying to sleep, animal sounds were just part of the environment. If a cow decided to vocalize at 3 a.m, there wasn't much you could do about it except wait for it to stop. If the chickens were upset about something and making a racket, you dealt with it or ignored it depending on whether you thought there was an actual problem or they were just being chickens. Managing the animals was significant work that required daily attention, even in winter when most outdoor work ceased. Animals needed to be fed, which meant accessing stored hay and grain and distributing it to the animals in their enclosures. They needed water, which meant melting snow or hauling water from a well that hopefully hadn't frozen, then getting the water to the animals. The manure needed to be managed, which meant periodically shoveling it out from the animal enclosures and moving it to wherever it was being stored for eventual use as fertilizer. In the depths of winter, this removal might happen less frequently because going outside to dispose of it was extremely unpleasant, which meant the manure would accumulate to greater depths before being removed. The health of the animals was a constant concern, because losing animals to disease or injury could be economically catastrophic. Animals living in close confinement were more susceptible to disease, particularly respiratory infections in the smoke-filled, poorly ventilated environment of the longhouse. Injuries could occur if animals fought with each other or if they injured themselves on parts of their enclosures. A cow with an infected wound or a respiratory infection needed treatment, which might include folk remedies of varying effectiveness because veterinary medicine as we know it didn't exist. Sometimes animals recovered, sometimes they didn't, and then you had the problem of a dead cow in your longhouse that needed to be dealt with, which in winter meant butchering it immediately and hoping you could preserve all the meat before it spoiled. The labor of caring for the animals typically fell to different household members based on the established division of labor. Milking was usually women's work, and it needed to happen daily for cows and goats that were in milk. This meant going into the animal section twice a day, probably in the early morning and evening, sitting next to the animal and hand milking it into a bucket or other container. If you've never milked an animal by hand, understand that it's skilled work that takes significant time and effort. A single cow might take 20 minutes or more to milk completely, and if you had multiple cows, you could easily spend 2 hours a day just on milking. Feeding and watering animals might be done by various household members, depending on who was available and capable. Children old enough to do useful work would certainly help with this, learning the skills they'd need later and contributing labor to the household economy. Thralls probably did much of the heavy work of hauling water and moving feed, as well as the unpleasant task of mucking out manure. The oversight of animal care, deciding when animals needed special attention, when to slaughter animals that weren't thriving, how to allocate feed supplies through the winter, would typically be the responsibility of the household head or his wife, depending on how labor was divided in that particular household. The economic importance of these animals cannot be overstated. The difference between a household with healthy, productive livestock and a household whose animals died during winter was the difference between relative prosperity and poverty. Milk production from cows and goats provided dairy products that were a major protein source and could be processed into butter and cheese for long-term storage. Sheep provided wool that could be spun and woven into cloth for clothing, trade goods, and sails for ships if you were producing at that scale. Animals were eventually slaughtered for meat, but more importantly, they were breeding stock that produced more animals, building the household's wealth over time. This meant that animals weren't just livestock in the modern sense. They were valuable property that represented years of accumulated wealth and careful management. A good milk cow might be worth as much as several years of a laborer's wages. A flock of healthy sheep represented significant wealth and the potential for future income from wool production. Losing these animals wasn't just an inconvenience. It could reduce a household from prosperity to struggling to survive within a single season. This is why people tolerated the smell, the noise, the mess, and all the other unpleasant aspects of living with animals. The alternative, trying to keep animals alive outdoors through a northern winter without adequate shelter, meant losing them, and losing them meant economic disaster. The relationship between humans and animals in the longhouse was complex, mixing practicality with what might have been genuine affection in some cases. Animals weren't pets in the modern sense. They were working animals and food sources, and sentimentality about them was a luxury most people couldn't afford. When an animal stopped being productive or when meat was needed, it was slaughtered without much ceremony. But at the same time, people spent hours every day caring for these animals, probably developed favorite individuals among the herd, and relied on them so completely that some degree of attachment was probably inevitable. A cow that had provided milk for years, that you'd cared for daily, that had produced calves that became part of your herd, was more than just livestock, even if you'd eventually eat it. The cycle of the seasons determined when animals came indoors and when they returned to outdoor pasture. As fall approached and temperatures began to drop, animals would gradually be brought into the longhouse or into attached shelters. The exact timing depended on weather conditions and available pasture, but generally this happened sometime in late fall, probably October or November by our calendar. The animals would then spend the next 5 to 6 months indoors, consuming stored feed and requiring constant care. As spring arrived and temperatures warmed, as grass began to grow again in the pastures, animals would be released back outside, and the longhouse could be thoroughly cleaned for the first time in months. That spring cleaning was a major undertaking. The accumulated manure from months of animal habitation needed to be removed, which meant shoveling out what might be several inches or even feet of compressed manure and soiled bedding. This material was valuable fertilizer and would be spread on fields, but moving it out of the longhouse was hard, unpleasant work that probably took several days and required everyone in the household who was physically capable to participate. The floors would then be cleaned as well as possible, scrubbed with water if it was available, perhaps allowed to dry out in the spring air, now that the smoke from the constant winter fire was reduced. New straw or rushes would be laid down, and the longhouse would be aired out, allowing months of accumulated smells to dissipate at least somewhat before the cycle began again the following fall. So picture yourself in the longhouse on a winter evening, sitting near the hearth trying to stay warm. Behind you, in the end section of the building, you can hear the cows shifting in their stalls, occasionally lowing. Sheep in another section periodically bleat. Chickens have roosted for the night, but occasionally cluck or flutter. The smell of animals mixes with all the other smells of the longhouse: smoke, cooking food, unwashed humans, the earthen floor. You've lived with these animals for months now, and you'll live with them for months more before spring arrives and they can go back outside. You know each cow individually, which one gives the most milk, which one is temperamental, which one might not survive the winter. Your economic survival depends on keeping these animals alive and healthy, and so you share your home with them, tolerate the smell and noise and mess, and accept that this is simply how winter works when you live in a place where the weather can kill as casually as it can sustain life. Chapter 8. Women's Work. The endless cycle of textile production. Now let's talk about what occupied an enormous portion of women's time and labor in Viking Age longhouses: textile production. This is one of those aspects of pre-modern life that's difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, where we buy clothes already made, where fabrics are mass-produced by machines, and where the entire process from raw fiber to finished garment is hidden from most people's everyday experience. But in the Viking Age, every single piece of fabric, every garment, every sail, every blanket, all of it was produced by hand, primarily by women, in a process that was so labor-intensive and time-consuming that it occupied a substantial portion of every day for virtually every woman in Scandinavia. Let's start with why textile production was so important, beyond the obvious need for clothing. Textiles were wealth. A household that could produce high-quality cloth had a trade good that could be exchanged for other resources, used to pay taxes or debts, given as gifts to establish or maintain social relationships, or sold for silver at markets. A wealthy woman was often described in terms of her textile production, not just as someone who wore nice clothes, but as someone who could make nice clothes, who supervised a household that produced textiles in quantity and quality. The keys that the lady of the house wore at her belt often included the key to the textile storage area, signifying her control over this valuable household resource. The process of creating textiles began with raw materials, which meant either fiber from sheep in the form of wool, or fiber from plants in the form of flax that would be processed into linen, or occasionally other materials like hemp or nettle fiber. Wool was by far the most common textile fiber in Scandinavia because sheep were abundant, they thrived in the climate, and wool has excellent properties for cold weather clothing. It's warm even when wet, it's durable, it can be processed into everything from coarse outer garments to fine soft fabrics, depending on the quality of the fleece and the skill of the processing. Sheep were sheared in the late spring or early summer, typically once a year, in a process that had to be accomplished relatively quickly before the weather got too hot and the sheep too uncomfortable with their full fleeces. Shearing was probably a communal activity, with multiple household members participating, using iron shears to clip the fleece as close to the skin as possible without injuring the animal. Each sheep might yield anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds of wool, depending on the breed and the quality of the fleece, and a household with 30 sheep might harvest 60 to 150 pounds of raw fleece in a season. This sounds like a lot until you realize how much of that weight is lost in processing and how much finished fabric is needed to clothe a household, and suddenly you understand why everyone who could spin and weave was doing so as much as possible. The raw fleece immediately after shearing was greasy with lanolin, dirty with whatever the sheep had gotten into, and often contained vegetable matter, dirt, and other debris that needed to be removed. The first step in processing was washing the fleece, which meant hauling enough water to handle pounds of wool, possibly heating some of that water, agitating the fleece to remove dirt and some of the excess lanolin, then rinsing it clean. This had to be done carefully to avoid felting the wool. If you agitated wool too roughly in hot water, the fibers locked together permanently, which is useful if you're making felt deliberately, but disastrous if you're trying to preserve the individual fibers for spinning. After washing, the fleece needed to be dried, which meant spreading it out in the sun or hanging it up where air could circulate through it. This could take days, depending on weather conditions, and wet wool is heavy and unpleasant to handle. Once dry, the fleece needed to be sorted, separating the finest, softest wool that would be used for garments worn next to the skin from the coarser wool that would be used for outer garments, blankets, and other items where softness was less critical. This sorting required knowledge and skill to assess fiber quality and assign it to appropriate uses. The next step was carding or combing the wool, depending on what characteristics you wanted in the final yarn. Carding involved using 2 paddles with fine wire teeth, pulling them across each other with wool between them, which aligned the fibers in random directions and created a fluffy mass suitable for spinning into fuzzy, warm yarn. Combing used combs with longer teeth, pulling the fibers through to align them parallel to each other, which created yarn that was smooth and strong, but less insulating. Both methods required time and repetitive motion. Carding or combing enough wool to spin for a day might take an hour or more of preparatory work. Then came spinning, the process of taking those prepared fibers and twisting them together to create continuous yarn that could be woven into fabric. This was done using a spindle, a simple tool consisting of a stick with a weight on it, or in some regions and time periods, a spinning wheel, though the wheel was a later medieval invention and wasn't commonly used in the Viking Age. Spinning with a drop spindle was skilled work that required constant attention and coordination. You'd pull out a small amount of fibre from your prepared wool, attach it to the yarn already on the spindle, give the spindle a twist to set it rotating, and carefully control the rate at which fibre was released and twist was added to create yarn of consistent thickness and strength. A skilled spinner could produce quite fine, even yarn at a reasonable pace, but it still took substantial time to spin enough yarn for any significant project. Spinning yarn for a single garment might take weeks of work, spinning several hours a day. Spinning enough yarn to weave fabric for an entire household's clothing needs, plus blankets, plus any textiles produced for trade, was essentially a full-time occupation that multiple women in the household might share. Women spun while sitting by the fire in the evening, while watching children, while supervising other work, while walking from one place to another. Any time their hands were free, they could be spinning, and they often were. The archaeology of Viking Age sites has found enormous numbers of spindle whorls, the weights used on drop spindles, which tells us just how ubiquitous spinning was. Every household had them, often multiple examples, sometimes decorated to show ownership or status. Some spindle whorls were made from simple stone or clay. Others were made from bone or antler, carved with intricate designs, turned into small works of art even though they were functional tools. The presence of a beautiful spindle whorl in a woman's grave was one indication of her status as a skilled textile worker, someone who had spent thousands of hours spinning and whose competence in this essential skill was worth commemorating after death. Once sufficient yarn had been spun, the next step was weaving, which transformed yarn into fabric. This required a loom, and the type of loom most commonly used in Viking Age Scandinavia was the warp-weighted loom, a vertical structure where the warp threads, the threads running the length of the fabric, hung down from a beam at the top and were kept taut by clay or stone weights tied to the bottom. The weaver stood in front of this loom and worked the weft threads, the threads running across the width of the fabric through the warp threads, creating cloth row by row from the top down. Setting up a warp-weighted loom was itself a significant undertaking that might take a full day or more. The warp threads needed to be measured to the right length, attached to the top beam in the correct order and spacing, weighted at the bottom with weights of appropriate mass and distribution, and adjusted so that the tension was even across the entire width of the fabric. Once set up, the loom could be used to weave quite a long piece of fabric, potentially 8 feet or more, before it needed to be cut off and a new warp prepared. But that setup time meant that weaving was something you committed to for an extended period, not a task you could start and stop casually. The actual weaving process required skill, patience, and sustained attention. The weaver passed the weft thread across the width of the loom, used a weaving sword or batten to beat the new thread firmly against the growing fabric, changed the shed, the opening between warp threads, to allow the next pass of the weft to go over and under the opposite set of warp threads, and repeated this process hundreds or thousands of times to create fabric. A skilled weaver working consistently might produce several inches of fabric in a day, perhaps a foot if conditions were favorable, and the fabric was relatively simple. Complex patterns like twill required more complicated threading and more attention, which slowed the process. Different weave structures created fabrics with different properties. Plain weave, the simplest pattern, was strong and serviceable but relatively inflexible. Twill weaves created fabric with more drape and a distinctive diagonal pattern that was suitable for better clothing. Some weavers created complex patterns with multiple colors of yarn, geometric designs, or even pictorial elements, demonstrating both technical skill and artistic creativity. These elaborate textiles took even longer to produce, but were valuable and prestigious items. Once fabric had been woven, it might go through additional processing depending on what it was intended for. Fulling, washing and beating the cloth to shrink and tighten it, created denser, more weather-resistant fabric suitable for outer garments. This was hard physical labor, typically done by trampling the wet cloth or beating it with wooden implements, and it required strength and stamina. Dyeing could be done at the yarn stage or after the fabric was complete, using vegetable dyes extracted from various plants, lichens, and other natural sources. Different dyes produce different colors. Madder root for red, woad for blue, various plants for yellows and greens, and achieving deep, even colors required skill and often multiple dye baths. Only after all of this work, shearing, washing, sorting, carding, spinning, weaving, fulling, and possibly dyeing, did you finally have fabric that could be cut and sewn into garments. And then the sewing itself was more handwork, using bone or metal needles and carefully stitching pieces together to create tunics, dresses, cloaks, and all the other garments a household needed. A single outfit, an undertunic, an overdress, perhaps a cloak, might represent hundreds of hours of labor spread across multiple women over weeks or months. When you wore that garment, you were literally wearing the accumulated labor of your household's women, and the quality and condition of your clothing said something about the productivity and skill of the women in your family. This is why clothing was valuable and carefully maintained. You didn't just throw away a garment because it had a hole or a stain. You repaired it, patched it, altered it to fit a different person as children grew or adults aged, and eventually, when it was too worn for clothing, you might repurpose the fabric for something else. Rags for cleaning, patches for other garments, stuffing for mattresses, anything that extracted the last bit of utility from fabric that represented so much invested labor. Clothing was passed down through families, and a particularly fine garment might be worn by multiple generations before it finally wore out completely. The time requirements for textile production meant that women were essentially always working at some stage of this process. Spinning was something that could be done while doing other things. Watching children, supervising cooking, having conversations, and women's hands were rarely idle. Weaving required more focused attention and a dedicated space for the loom, but it was still social work that could be done while talking or listening to stories. Multiple women might work on textile production together, teaching skills to daughters, comparing techniques, sharing the labor in a way that was both practical and socially important. For a household woman of any significant status, the supervision of textile production was one of her primary responsibilities. She needed to ensure that fleece was properly processed, that enough yarn was being spun to keep the weavers supplied, that the weavers were producing fabric of appropriate quality and in the types needed by the household, and that finished textiles were properly stored and allocated to appropriate uses. This required management skills, technical knowledge, and the authority to direct the labor of other women and girls in the household. A woman who was particularly skilled at this might supervise textile production for a large household with multiple women working under her direction, essentially acting as a production manager for what was one of the household's most important economic activities. So when you picture the women in that longhouse on a winter evening, understand that their hands are rarely still. Someone is carding wool, preparing it for spinning. Someone else has a spindle in hand, the weight twisting and dropping, pulling fiber into yarn. an action repeated so many times that it's almost automatic. Over in the corner, perhaps someone is at the loom, weaving by firelight, the rhythmic sound of the weaving sword beating the weft into place, a constant background noise. Girls are learning these skills, their first clumsy attempts at spinning, gradually improving with practice. Even the elderly woman whose fingers are stiff with age might be doing some task that doesn't require fine motor control. Sorting fleece, winding yarn into balls. Something that keeps her contributing to the household's production. This is women's work. Not in the diminishing sense that the modern phrase sometimes carries, but in the sense that it was essential, skilled, economically vital labor that required years to master and that occupied the majority of women's working hours throughout their lives. A household without women skilled in textile production couldn't produce enough fabric to clothe itself or generate textile trade goods, which would significantly hamper its economic viability. The woman who could card and spin and weave and sew efficiently was as essential to her household survival as the man who could plow fields and manage livestock and fight when necessary. Different labor, different skills, but equal in their importance to keeping the household functioning and prosperous in a world where every necessity had to be produced through skilled human labor and nothing could simply be purchased ready-made. Chapter 9. The Rhythm of Seasons. How life transformed throughout the year. Life in a Viking longhouse wasn't a static, unchanging existence where every day looked more or less like the one before it. Instead, it followed a rhythm dictated by the seasons, with each part of the year bringing its own particular challenges, opportunities, and patterns of work. The difference between summer and winter in Viking-age Scandinavia was so dramatic that they were almost different worlds. And understanding this seasonal rhythm is essential to understanding how people actually lived and what their days looked like at different times of the year. This wasn't just about weather being warmer or colder, though that was certainly significant. It was about fundamental changes in what work needed to be done, what food was available, how much daylight there was to work by, and even what social activities were possible. Let's start with spring, which arrived late in the northern latitudes and was probably greeted with a level of relief and joy that's difficult for most modern people to understand. Imagine you've just spent 5 or 6 months living in a smoky, crowded, increasingly foul longhouse, eating preserved foods that are running low and decreasing in quality. Unable to go outside for extended periods because the weather could literally kill you. Watching your carefully hoarded supplies dwindle and hoping they'll last until fresh food becomes available again. And then, gradually, the days begin to lengthen. The temperature starts to rise, though warm is a relative term in places like Norway and Iceland. Snow begins to melt. Ice breaks up on rivers and lakes. The world, which has been frozen and dead for months, starts to show signs of life again. Spring was a time of intense activity because so much needed to happen in a relatively short window. Fields that had been frozen and snow-covered needed to be prepared for planting, which meant ploughing, hard, physical labor with a wooden plough pulled by oxen or horses if you had them, or by humans if you didn't. The soil needed to be broken up, prepared to receive seeds. Barley, oats, rye, and other grains needed to be planted at the right time. Not so early that a late frost would kill the young plants, but not so late that the growing season would be insufficient for the crop to mature. This timing required knowledge and judgment, the kind of agricultural wisdom that was passed down through generations, and that could mean the difference between a successful harvest and a failed one. Animals that had been kept inside or in shelters through the winter could finally be released to pasture again, which must have been a relief to everyone. The longhouse could be thoroughly cleaned for the first time in months, with accumulated manure and soiled bedding removed, floors scrubbed, everything aired out. Animals could graze on the new grass that was finally growing again, which meant not needing to feed them from dwindling stores of hay and grain. Cows and goats that had gone dry during winter would freshen, give birth and begin producing milk again, providing fresh dairy products after months of relying on stored butter and cheese. Spring was also when fishing became productive again in many areas, with various species of fish migrating or spawning in ways that made them easier to catch. This provided fresh protein after a winter of preserved meat and salted fish, and it was probably a welcome change in diet. Wild plants began to grow again, and women and children would forage for edible greens and herbs that provided fresh vegetables and important vitamins after a winter diet that had been heavy on preserved foods and light on anything fresh. These wild greens were probably not just enjoyed but actually craved, as bodies that had been borderline scurvy-ridden from lack of vitamin C for months desperately needed fresh plant foods. But spring was also a dangerous time, particularly the period called the spring famine, when winter food supplies were running critically low, but new food sources weren't yet abundant. The stored grain was almost gone. The preserved meat might be finished or close to it. The dried fish had been eaten. The root vegetables in storage were sprouting or rotting. And the new crops hadn't matured yet. The animals hadn't been fattened on summer pasture yet. The fishing hadn't yet yielded sufficient catch to rebuild supplies. People might be genuinely hungry during this period, rationing carefully, eating things they wouldn't normally consider food. Bark bread extended with ground tree bark. Any edible plant they could find. Animals slaughtered earlier than ideal because food was needed now, even if it meant less meat available later. Summer, when it finally arrived, was a time of abundance but also of frantic labor, because so much needed to be accomplished during the brief period of warmth and long daylight. In the far north, summer days could be extraordinarily long. 18, 20, or even 24 hours of daylight at the height of summer. This allowed work to continue essentially around the clock, limited only by human endurance rather than by darkness. Fields needed constant attention, with weeding and monitoring to ensure crops were growing properly. Animals needed to be moved between pastures, monitored for illness or injury, milked daily. Dairy production was at its peak, which meant milk needed to be processed into butter and cheese for storage, a daily task that occupied significant labor. Hay needed to be cut, dried and stored for winter animal feed, and this was absolutely critical work because the survival of the animals through the next winter depended on having sufficient hay supplies. A rainy summer that prevented hay from drying properly could be disastrous. Too short a growing season might mean insufficient hay harvest. The hay harvest was probably a communal effort, with everyone in the household who was physically capable participating, working long hours to cut the grass, turn it to promote drying, and then gather it and transport it to storage before weather could ruin it. Thousands of pounds of hay needed to be processed and stored, representing weeks of hard labor compressed into the short window when conditions were favorable. Summer was also the season for travel and trade, because the seas were navigable and the weather was less likely to kill you on the road. Merchant ships would travel between ports, trading goods produced over the winter and spring. Raiding expeditions would leave during this period, as men who were farmers for most of the year temporarily became warriors and adventurers, seeking wealth and status through warfare. This meant that many longhouses lost significant portions of their male labor force during the summer, with men away for weeks or months while women, children, elderly people and thralls handled the agricultural work that couldn't wait. Some men didn't come back, killed in raids or lost at sea, which meant some households would face the next winter without the labor and leadership they depended on. The social calendar was also busiest in summer because this was when it was actually possible to travel to assemblies, festivals, and gatherings. The Thing, the assembly where legal cases were heard and political decisions made, typically met in summer when people could actually travel to reach it. Weddings often happened in summer because that's when you could gather people together and when food was abundant enough to provide a proper feast. Religious festivals and sacrifices happened during this season, communal celebrations that brought multiple households or even entire communities together. After months of isolation during winter, these gatherings were probably important social events, chances to see people from outside your immediate household, to hear news from other areas, to arrange marriages and alliances and business dealings. As summer progressed toward fall, the focus shifted to harvest and preservation, the critical work of gathering and storing enough food to survive the next winter. Grain crops needed to be harvested at exactly the right time. Too early and the grain wouldn't be fully mature. Too late and you risked losing it to weather or birds or mold. The harvest was intense labor, cutting the grain with sickles or scythes, binding it into sheaves, transporting it to storage, threshing it to separate grain from stalks, winnowing to remove the chaff, and finally storing the cleaned grain in ways that would keep it dry and protected from pests. Every household member capable of working would be involved, because this was literally harvesting the food that would keep everyone alive through the winter. Fall was also slaughtering season, when animals that couldn't be supported through winter were killed and their meat preserved. This was a calculated decision based on how much stored feed was available, how many animals could be maintained through the winter, and how much meat was needed to feed the household. Young animals might be slaughtered because they'd require more care through winter. Older animals that were no longer productive might be killed. Animals that seemed unlikely to survive winter due to illness or weakness would certainly be slaughtered while their meat could still be used. The slaughtering itself was skilled work that needed to be done efficiently to avoid waste, and the immediate aftermath was a period of intense activity as meat was salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise preserved before it could spoil. Other foods were also being preserved during fall. Fish were caught and dried in large quantities. Vegetables from the garden were harvested and stored. Berries and other wild foods were gathered and preserved. Mushrooms were collected and dried. Everything that could possibly be stored for winter use needed to be processed now, because once winter arrived, opportunities to supplement your food supplies would be minimal. The success or failure of these preservation efforts would determine whether the household ate well through the winter or barely survived. So the work was done carefully and thoroughly despite the time pressure. As fall transitioned into winter, the focus shifted to preparing the longhouse and the household for the long period of confinement and cold that was coming. Repairs to the longhouse needed to be completed before weather made outdoor work impossible. Roof damage fixed, walls reinforced, doors adjusted to seal properly. Firewood needed to be cut and stacked in quantities sufficient to last months, which was an enormous amount of wood. Multiple cords, representing weeks of labor to fell trees, cut them to length, split them, and transport them to storage. Animals were brought inside to their winter quarters. The household essentially battened down for winter, preparing to retreat into the longhouse and wait out the cold and dark. Winter was the quietest season in terms of outdoor agricultural work, but it was hardly a time of rest. The animals still needed daily care, feeding, watering, mucking out manure. The fire needed constant attention. Food needed to be prepared 3 times a day. Textile work continued, probably intensified because this was when women had more time to focus on spinning and weaving without the competing demands of agricultural work. Tools and equipment were maintained and repaired. Men might work on woodworking projects, craft items for trade, repair weapons and other equipment, or engage in various indoor crafts. Children were probably underfoot constantly, bored and restless from confinement, needing to be supervised and kept occupied. The darkness of winter in northern latitudes was profound and psychologically challenging. In the far north, the sun might not rise above the horizon for weeks or months, creating a period of constant twilight or darkness that was broken only by firelight and the occasional clear night when stars and aurora provided some illumination. Even in less extreme latitudes, winter days were short, perhaps 6 to 8 hours of weak sunlight, barely enough to accomplish necessary outdoor tasks. Most life happened by firelight, which was dim and flickering, making detailed work difficult and creating a permanent gloom inside the longhouse. The long, dark evenings were filled with storytelling, craft work, maintenance tasks, and probably a fair amount of tension as people who'd been confined together for weeks or months got on each other's nerves. Winter was also when food supplies dwindled and diet became monotonous. The variety of fall harvest gave way to increasingly limited options as supplies were consumed. By late winter, many households were eating basically the same things every day: porridge, dried fish, some preserved meat if supplies held out, stored root vegetables, dairy products if they'd been well preserved. Fresh food was essentially non-existent. Scurvy and other deficiency diseases would begin to appear in households whose preserved foods didn't provide adequate nutrition. Hunger was real, particularly in years when the harvest had been poor or when winter lasted longer than expected. People lost weight during winter, particularly children and elderly people who might be given smaller rations when food was scarce. The psychological weight of winter should not be underestimated. Months of confinement in dim, smoky conditions, eating monotonous food, with no privacy, limited activity, and no certain knowledge of when conditions would improve. This was genuinely difficult, and evidence suggests that depression and interpersonal conflict increased during winter. The sagas mention winter weariness, a kind of melancholy or irritability that set in during the long, dark months. Modern researchers would probably recognize this as seasonal affective disorder combined with the stress of confinement and resource scarcity. But the Vikings didn't have a clinical name for it. They just knew that winter was hard, that people got short-tempered and sad, and that you endured it because there was no alternative. And then, eventually, spring would come again. The cycle would repeat, and life would continue in its seasonal rhythm. This annual pattern shaped everything about Viking life: when you worked and what work you did, what you ate and when you ate it, who was present in the household and who was away, what social activities were possible, even your emotional state and energy levels. Understanding this rhythm means understanding that a Viking longhouse in summer was a very different place from the same longhouse in winter. That the people living there were doing different work, eating different food, experiencing different challenges, and probably feeling quite different about their circumstances, depending on whether they were in the abundance of summer or the scarcity of late winter. Chapter 10. children, stories, and long evenings. How Vikings filled the hours between work and sleep. Life in a Viking longhouse wasn't all grueling labor and survival challenges, though there was certainly plenty of both. There were also children playing and learning, stories being told around the fire, skills being taught and practiced, games being played, and all the other activities that humans engage in when basic survival needs have been met and there are hours to fill before sleep. Understanding how Vikings, particularly children, spent their time when they weren't working gives us insight into the human side of longhouse life. The moments of joy and connection that made the hardships bearable and created the social bonds that held households and communities together. Children in Viking-age longhouses were everywhere, making noise, getting into things, learning skills, and generally being children in all the ways that children have always been children. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps a third or more of children died before age 5 from disease, accidents, malnutrition, or the various other hazards of pre-modern life. But the children who survived those dangerous early years were numerous and active. A typical household might have 5 to 10 children of various ages, from infants to teenagers, all living in the communal space of the longhouse and learning through observation and participation how to be functional adults in Viking society. Very young children, those under perhaps 5 or 6 years old, were primarily the responsibility of women and older girls in the household. Infants were nursed, typically for 2 or 3 years, which provided nutrition and some protection from disease, while also serving as a form of birth control, since frequent nursing suppressed fertility to some degree. Babies were probably worn in slings or carriers that allowed women to keep them close while working, a practical solution when you needed to have your hands free but couldn't leave an infant unattended. Toddlers were watched by whoever had time, encouraged to play in areas where they wouldn't be underfoot or in danger, and gradually integrated into the household's daily routines. As children grew older, they began to take on real responsibilities and to learn the skills they'd need as adults. This education wasn't formal in the sense of sitting in a classroom learning from books. It was entirely practical, hands-on learning through observation and participation. Boys began to help with tasks that were defined as men's work. Tending animals, helping with farming, learning to use tools and weapons, practicing the skills of navigation and seamanship if they lived in a coastal area. Girls learned women's work, textile production, food preparation and preservation, household management, dairy work, and all the other skills that a competent adult woman needed to know. This gendered division of labor was rigid and began early, preparing children for the adult roles they'd be expected to fill. The teaching was probably mostly informal, with children watching adults work and gradually being allowed to help with simple tasks, then given increasing responsibility as they demonstrated competence. A 5-year-old might be sent to collect eggs from chickens, or to watch younger children while adults were busy. A 7-year-old might help with feeding animals or with simple aspects of food preparation. A 10-year-old might be trusted with more complex tasks, helping with milking, spinning yarn, assisting with agricultural work, that required more skill and judgment. By their early teens, children were doing essentially adult work, perhaps not as efficiently or skillfully as experienced adults, but contributing genuinely valuable labor to the household economy. Children's play existed, though it was probably less separated from work than it is in modern societies. Children played games, some of which have been preserved in archaeological records or in later folklore. They played with toys, simple dolls, carved animals, toy weapons for boys who were learning to be warriors. They played physically active games that built strength and coordination. They almost certainly engaged in make-believe play, pretending to be adults doing adult tasks or acting out stories they'd heard. But this play often blended seamlessly with actual work, as children helped with real tasks while treating them as games, or as play activities taught skills that would be useful later. Education in practical skills was the primary focus, but children also learned the oral traditions of their culture. The stories, poems, genealogies, and historical accounts that were preserved through memorization and recitation, since written records were limited. Children listened to the stories told around the fire in the evenings, absorbing the myths of the gods, the legends of heroes, the history of their family and community. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were the textbooks of Viking culture, teaching values, preserving history, explaining the world, and providing examples of proper and improper behavior. A child who listened carefully to these stories was receiving an education in their culture's worldview and in what it meant to be a properly functioning member of society. Teenagers and young adults occupied an interesting position in the household hierarchy, old enough to do adult work and to be held to adult standards of productivity, but not yet fully independent or in control of their own destinies. A teenage boy might be as strong and capable as an adult man, doing the same work and producing comparable results. But he still lived under his father's authority and couldn't make major decisions about his own life without permission. A teenage girl might be fully skilled in all aspects of women's work, but she remained under her father's control until she married, at which point she'd transfer to her husband's household and authority. This period of being physically adult but socially subordinate must have created tensions, particularly for young people who were ready to establish their own households, but who didn't yet have the resources or permission to do so. The long winter evenings, when outdoor work was impossible and daylight was limited, were prime time for storytelling. And this is when much of the oral tradition was transmitted and reinforced. After the evening meal, as people sat around the fire doing handwork or simply resting, someone, often an older person who was no longer capable of heavy physical labor, but who remembered many stories, would tell tales. These range from myths about the gods, Thor's battles with giants, Odin's quest for wisdom, Loki's tricks and the trouble they caused, to legendary sagas about famous heroes and their exploits, to family genealogies and historical accounts, to local ghost stories and folklore about supernatural beings who inhabited the landscape. The storyteller was performing, using voice and gesture to bring the story to life, probably encouraged by the reactions of the audience. These weren't just recitations of memorized text. They were living performances where a skilled storyteller could adapt the story to the audience and the occasion, emphasizing certain elements, drawing out suspenseful moments, adding flourishes that made the story more engaging. The best storytellers were valued members of the household or community, and their performances were anticipated and enjoyed. For children listening in the firelight, these stories must have been magical, filling their imaginations with images of gods and giants, heroes and monsters, adventures and battles, all rendered more vivid by the dim, flickering light and the smoky atmosphere of the longhouse. Poetry was another important form of entertainment and cultural transmission, though Viking Age poetry was nothing like modern poetry in its themes or structure. Skaldic verse, the complex alliterative poetry practiced by trained poets, was dense with metaphorical language called kennings, required extensive cultural knowledge to fully understand, and demonstrated both the poet's skill and the sophistication of the audience who could appreciate it. A jarl or wealthy householder might have a skald in his household, someone whose job was to compose and perform poetry praising the household's achievements and preserving their deeds in memorable verse. Less formal poetry and songs were probably common as well, performed by ordinary people who'd learned traditional verses or composed simpler pieces themselves. Music was part of Longhouse entertainment, though we know relatively little about what Viking Age music actually sounded like, since musical notation didn't exist, and we're left with only descriptions and archaeological finds of instruments. Lyres and other stringed instruments have been found in high-status graves, suggesting that instrumental music was valued, at least among the wealthy. Singing was almost certainly common, with work songs to make repetitive labor more bearable, ballads telling stories in musical form, and simple entertainment songs. The human voice, accompanied perhaps by a simple instrument or by rhythmic clapping or foot stomping, was probably the most common form of music in most households. Games and contests provided entertainment and also served as practice for useful skills or as ways to demonstrate prowess and establish social hierarchy. Board games existed. Several examples have been found archaeologically, including elaborate gaming boards and beautifully carved game pieces, and were played by adults and children, sometimes for entertainment and sometimes as gambling with stakes. Physical contests tested strength, skill, and courage. Wrestling, running, jumping, swimming, and various forms of mock combat with weapons. These contests were more than just fun. They were how young men demonstrated their fitness as warriors, how social hierarchies were established and maintained, and how reputation was built or damaged based on performance. Crafts and handwork filled many evening hours, combining productivity with sociability. Women spun and sewed while talking and listening to stories. Men carved wood, bone, and antler into useful items or decorative pieces, turning raw materials into tools, game pieces, ornaments, or trade goods. Older people who could no longer do heavy labor might spend their time on fine detail work, intricate carving, careful sewing, or other tasks that required skill and patience, but not physical strength. This work was done by firelight, which was dim and flickering and hard on the eyes, but it was productive use of time that would otherwise be wasted, and it provided a focus for hands while the mind engaged with conversation or stories. Alcohol was part of Viking social life, particularly on festive occasions, though daily consumption was probably more limited for most people. Mead, fermented honey and water, was the most prestigious alcoholic beverage, but was expensive because honey was scarce and valuable. Beer made from grain was more common, typically weak enough that it was safer to drink than water and wouldn't cause significant intoxication in normal amounts. Stronger drinks might be consumed at feasts and celebrations, sometimes to excess, as the sagas are full of stories about drinking parties that ended in fights, boasts that came back to haunt the boaster, or decisions made while drunk that had serious consequences. But for everyday consumption in most households, alcohol was probably a mild, slightly nutritious beverage rather than a strong intoxicant. Feasts and celebrations broke up the routine of everyday life, marking important occasions with special food, entertainment, and social gathering. Weddings, religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, successful raids or trading expeditions, births, funerals. All of these might be marked with a feast where the household or community gathered, consumed better food than usual in larger quantities, drank more freely, told stories and performed poetry, played games and generally celebrated together. These events were important social occasions that strengthened community bonds, allowed for the establishment of new relationships and alliances, and provided memorable breaks from the ordinary hardships of daily life. Religious observances were probably integrated into longhouse life in ways that weren't always clearly separated from other activities. Sacrifices to the gods might be performed at certain times of year, with animals slaughtered in ritual fashion, and their meat then consumed by the household in a feast that was simultaneously religious and social. Household spirits and protective beings were acknowledged through various practices. Offerings left for the landvatir, who protected the farmstead, respect shown to the ancestors who watched over the family, perhaps small shrines or sacred objects kept in the longhouse that represented the household's spiritual connections. These practices weren't organized religion in the Christian sense, with formal theology and universal practices. They were more personal and household-specific, varying from one family to another based on tradition and individual belief. The hour before sleep was probably gradual rather than sudden, with people finishing their final tasks of the day, banking the fire for the night, arranging their bedding, settling children, and slowly transitioning from waking activity to rest. The fire would be reduced to coals, providing some warmth through the night, but not enough light to work by. Conversation would gradually quiet. People would find their sleeping spots and settle in. Children would be tucked into bed, perhaps with a lullaby or a brief story. And gradually, the longhouse would transition into its nighttime state. Never truly quiet, because 30 people sleeping in one space are never quiet, but quieter than the daytime bustle, with only the sounds of breathing, snoring, the occasional cry of a baby or restless sleeper, the settling of the fire, and the wind outside making its presence known against the thick turf walls. This daily cycle of work, social interaction, entertainment, education, and rest repeated itself day after day, varied by season and by the particular circumstances of the household, but following generally similar patterns. Life in a Viking longhouse was hard, certainly, full of labour and discomfort and challenges that most modern people would find intolerable. But it was also life in the full sense. People loving and fighting and raising children and telling stories and creating beauty and dealing with loss and celebrating joys and doing all the things that humans have always done. The longhouse was more than just a structure or even just a shelter. It was the container for human life in all its messy, complicated, frustrating, and occasionally transcendent reality. And so, as we reach the end of tonight's journey through the Viking longhouse, we're reminded that history isn't just a collection of dates and battles and famous names. It's the accumulated experience of real people living real lives in circumstances both remarkably different from and surprisingly similar to our own. The Vikings who gathered around their central hearths, who slept pressed together on communal platforms, who endured the smoke and the smell and the cold, who raised children and told stories and spun wool by firelight, weren't exotic others from an incomprehensible past. They were humans dealing with the challenges of their particular time and place, using the tools and knowledge available to them, finding moments of joy and connection amid the hardships, and generally doing their best to survive, and perhaps thrive in a world that didn't make survival easy. The longhouse itself, that practical and ingenious structure of turf and timber, was more than just architecture. It was a solution to the problem of how to keep people alive in one of the harshest climates humans have chosen to inhabit. It wasn't comfortable by our standards, but it worked. It protected people from weather that could kill them in hours. It provided a space where families could gather, where children could be raised, where work could be accomplished. where culture could be transmitted from one generation to the next. For all its smoke and smell and lack of privacy, the Longhouse was home, and the people who lived there made it work through ingenuity, cooperation, hard labor, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd learned what it took to survive. If you've made it this far in our journey, you now know more about the daily reality of Viking life than most people ever learn. You know what they ate and how they cooked it, where they slept and who they slept near, how they managed waste and why everything smelled like smoke, why they brought animals inside, and how women spent thousands of hours producing textiles, how seasons shaped their lives and how they filled their evening hours. These aren't the dramatic stories of raids and battles that dominate popular culture's vision of the Vikings. They're the quieter, but more fundamental realities of how people actually lived day by day, season by season, year by year. I hope this brought you some peace tonight. Maybe taught you something new about a culture and a way of life that's separated from us by more than 1,000 years, but remains connected to us by the simple fact of shared humanity. Sleep well, knowing that countless generations before us have also settled into sleep at the end of long days. That the challenges we face are different in their specifics, but similar in their fundamentals to the challenges humans have always faced. And that we're part of an unbroken chain of people who've lived and loved and raised children and told stories and done their best with what they had. Rest easy, and I'll see you in the next one.